Oh, am I live? Oh, I'm live now. Okay, so this just dropped like 4 hours ago from the time of me recording this. It's one of those surrounded things with Jordan Peterson versus a bunch of atheists. Now, I used to follow Jordan Peterson very closely. I don't follow him as much anymore, but I still like him. I like the stuff he says when he comes up. I've read both of his 12 Years for Life books. I tried to get through Maps of Meaning, but it is just so ungodly long and gets so boring at times I didn't make it. But anyway, I say all that to say I know Jordan Peterson. I know a lot. I know his daughter Michaela converted to Christianity. I don't know if he did. I think he's still on the whole I live as if God exists thing. But he's had some pretty good stuff. I do enjoy his biblical takes, like his old, especially his old Bible series. I thought was pretty good, if not super accurate. It was interesting, is the best word for it. So, like I said, this just dropped. I decided to do an impromptu stream. Like I don't even know what's going on here. Oh, I am live. Yeah, so I just decided to do an impromptu stream, and we're gonna see how this goes. So I'm gonna play this and I'm gonna watch this and just give some thoughts on it. All right, let's do it.
You say that. I haven't claimed that.
Oh, what is this? Is this Christians versus atheists?
Don't be a smartass.
Either you're a Christian or you're not. Which one is it?
You're really quite something, you are.
Aren't I? But you're really quite nothing. Right? You're not a Christian.
Okay, I'm done with him. Hello there. I'm Dr. Jordan Peterson. I'm a clinical psychologist, a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto, an author, a podcaster, public speaker, and today I'm surrounded by 25 atheists. My first claim, atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting.
Okay, that's an interesting claim. I don't even know what to say about that because God isn't fully understandable by anybody. So I want to hear him like detail what he means by that.
Good afternoon, Dr. Peterson.
How you doing?
So this claim here that atheists don't know what they're rejecting. My background is in studying to become a traditional Catholic priest, daily mass, daily rosary, going on long retreats, deep into the magisterium and biblical hermeneutics. Like I was thoroughly in it. And it seems like I do know what I'm missing. Is there something that I missed over years of study, both this issue formally and living out religion so deeply?
Well, you obviously feel that you missed.
Yeah, I've noticed that's always the thing, is that I was so deep into it. So I fully understand what I'm doing here. And usually that's not the case. At least when you start talking to them, even though they claim to have studied it so closely and been so deep in Christianity, they tend to know almost nothing about it. The thing here is Jordan Peterson's not saying they don't understand Christianity, but they don't understand God. So I'm wondering if anybody's going to bring that up. They're probably not.
Something when you were practicing for the priesthood, your aim was off then. So there's always the possibility that it's still off now.
What was off about my aim in the first place?
I don't know. That might take a long time to figure out. But
Then it seems kind of like this no true Scotsman type of fallacy in which you're the arbiter of people's aims and how they understand those aims to be. How is it that you can claim that people don't know something that you know?
I mean, he's saying your aim was off because you went to do it and then you backed out of it. So if you clearly don't feel that you were on the right track, or else you would have kept doing
About
it.
their life despite not having met them?
Well, it's obviously a generic claim, just like the atheist claim that there's no God is a generic claim. In your case, it would have to be specified more, and I'm not claiming to understand what was going on in your mind, but my experience with atheists is twofold, is that they have a very reductive notion of what constitutes God, let's say in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and they've often been hurt by someone who was religious or by the religious enterprise or perhaps by God himself, so to speak, and that's left them with an animus.
But I think that you have a reductive view of what atheism is. You've defined religion so broadly to include any sort of having aim in life, any sort of cultural archetypes, or having a metaphorical substrate. And atheism to you is a very specific type of like three people in the world that are these Raskolnikov type of, they want to get away with a perfect murder. It seems like you have the reductive view of what an atheist is.
Well, let's start with...
An atheist is a person who believes there's no God. I mean, I don't know how that could be reductive unless he thinks something else.
With your claim, how do you define the God that you're rejecting? Like, what is God to you? You studied in the church, you found that unsatisfactory. How would you characterize what you rejected?
I think the average Christian believer, when they say that they're Christian and they believe, they mean some sort of God that is all-powerful, all-perfect, is somehow involved in the matters of this world, and that we look to them through wisdom and with the Logos incarnate in Christ. And it also seems like you don't believe in religion in the way that the average Christian says that they believe in religion. And there are as many gods out there as there are believers, because everybody has mutually exclusive and different views of what God is. So it seems
Well,
like...
if everybody had mutually exclusive views of what God is, no one could speak to each other. The mere fact of communication presumes a commonality of assumption and definition. And it's certainly not the case that I regard any archetypal manifestation whatsoever as equally religious. So that's not a real claim. Let me give you an example. For example, there's a sub-narrative in the story of Moses where Moses is rewarded with a glimpse of God. Okay, and that's one of the ways that God is characterized in the Old Testament stories.
Yes.
Now, Moses is a faithful servant of God and a good man. At least that's the case within the confines of the story.
One possible interpretation.
It's the case within the confines of the story, obviously.
Obviously. When we look at the Bible can't precisely say anything because there are so many different exegetical and hermeneutic views of this particular book, and that everybody has everybody has disagreed historically on, it seems like, even the most benign detail about a book this big. And it seems like you can only say that the Bible says something if you first presuppose that it's univocal.
You see, that's ridiculous. The Bible says what it says. When the Bible says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, nobody is disputing that the Bible says that God is the creator, for example. Nobody disputes that God created the earth. Even if they dispute when or how or the meaning of that, nobody disputes that. Nobody disputes that the Bible depicts God as being one God, for example, when they say our God is one. Yes, the views on the Trinity will say that it's there are three persons in the Trinity, but even Trinitarians are not saying there are multiple gods. Like, there's one God, that God is the creator, that God is more powerful than other gods, things like that. There's so much stuff in the Bible that's completely and utterly straightforward that's nobody disputes. And yeah, you can say that it says something else, but you can be wrong. People who like this will say that somebody can make a completely ridiculous claim about the Bible, like the Bible says that God is weak and will die one day. And they'll say, well, that's just your view, and nobody's view can be said to be perfect because the people aren't around anymore. That's what Dan McClellan tried to get me with, because I was saying that words have meanings, and the people who wrote the Bible meant something when they wrote it. And even if we can never know what they really meant, that doesn't mean that they didn't mean anything and we get to decide what they meant. Even if we don't know what they meant, that doesn't mean we can decide what they meant. So this is a ridiculous claim, and I hear it.
So your
all the
claim
time.
essentially is that Moses in the Old Testament plays the role of a villain or is irrelevant? Because the alternative claim
I'm
is
saying that we
he's
can't
good.
know, because we can't talk to those authors.
If you are going to start with the presupposition that there's nothing I can say about any of these stories that you're not going to disagree with from the perspective that there are multiple potential competing claims, then I can't speak with you. So
and we also have a short time here, so I want to get to the core of what you're arguing here, and I'd love if we could.
The core of what I'm arguing is that atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting. So I'm trying to give you an example of what's being rejected and its complexity. Okay, so God rewards Moses with a glimpse of the divine. So this is a definition of the God that atheists are hypothetically rejecting.
A possible one.
I said I didn't say the. I said
Right. It is possible, yes.
Okay. So despite the fact that Moses is a stellar character and he's had a long and difficult life and can withstand a lot of difficulty and travail, God puts him between two cliffs, so he can just see a crack of what's in front of him. And when God walks by, he allows him to see his back. Okay, so the implication of that story is that the divine is fundamentally unknowable. It's a pinnacle experience, and that people in their finitude have to be shielded from a comprehensive vision of.
Okay, so this is one thing that Jordan Peterson does that I find both interesting and kind of annoying. I like how he views scripture in this sort of allegorical way, almost in a way a lot of people who are preaching will sort of exposit the text, but sometimes it almost comes off as reaching the way he does it, because he comes up with these things that I feel like if the author was around, he'd probably be like, I mean, I get what you're saying there, but that's not what I meant. Just saying that I got a glimpse of God. But I think his position is, at least this is part of what I'm getting from the 3/4 of maps of meaning that I did manage to read, is that even if this isn't what was consciously in mind when the story was being written down, because of this like archetypical way he views like life in general and especially the Bible, even if that wasn't consciously what they meant, that's still something you could get from it on a subconscious level, and not even subconscious in the mind of the author, but just in the fundamental principles of the universe, period, which sounds crazy and kind of is crazy, but it is interesting to me.
The basis of reality. Well, that's not the God that's defined in that manner, right? It's not a simple personification. It's not a simple old man in the sky. It's something that in its essence is unknowable and overwhelming. And that isn't, in my experience, the God that's defined by atheists who are attempting to undermine the story. I mean, it's the same claim, for example, that you're a finite creature and that you face something that in the final analysis is unknowable, and that you have to establish a relationship with it regardless of your inability to perceive or even withstand perceiving the whole. Okay, is there a problem with that?
I mean, the problem is that when we look at, famously, when you've been asked, do you believe in God, the question becomes, what do we mean by God? And in the Bible, it's not even clear the biblical authors know what God is, because Yahweh has historically emerged from an early storm god, a deity that doesn't exhaust the category of deity, and that has changed over the Old.
Oh, see, and then they're going with the freaking old Yahweh was a storm god bullcrap. I'm not going to unpack that right now. I want to watch this, but this is what happens when you let dumb people have access to scholarship. If you just repeat, and I shouldn't call them dumb, but you just repeat everything that they hear without even understanding what they're really saying.
Testament, does God have physicality? Does God not have physicality? It seems like, yes, if you define religion to mean anybody that has an aim, anybody that looks at the unknown, anybody who wants to go from chaos to order is inherently religious, then yes. But also in the same way, I could define atheist as somebody who doesn't dogmatically believe in a religion, or somebody who doesn't regularly attend religious services or belong to a denomination. To help especially the...
That's dumb. Somebody who says I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, so they don't dogmatically appear to anything, but they believe in God, but they don't go to church, but they believe in the supernatural. You could define that as an atheist. Atheist meaning they don't believe there is a God. So a person can believe in God and he could still define him as an atheist. That's stupid. That's what I mean. When like he's taking, and Jordan Peterson's beliefs are infuriatingly nebulous sometimes, but they don't go out into the realm of I could believe two freaking contradictory things just because I don't have a definition.
Audience, kind of like boil this down. There was a lot of...
Oh, hey, Jamel. Yeah, no, the storm god thing comes from, you know how God was like on a cloud and stuff like that. There's a lot of things that talk about, even with the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. It's stuff like that was said about like ancient Near Eastern storm deities and stuff like that. And you know, a lot of looking at a lot of the scholarship, you'll learn very quickly that some of the connections that they make are extremely, extremely flimsy. And I'm not an archaeologist or a scholar, so I don't want to tell them how to do their jobs. But some of the connections they make are so flimsy, it's absolutely insane. And some of it is circular. Just real quick before I continue this, because this video was long. There's like one of the Psalms, I think it's Psalm 82, that the one that says that he stands like among the gods. They take that and combine it with this theory that God was originally one of a pantheon of gods and was a lesser God. And by virtue of that, they say, well, this psalm predates the modern version of God. I'm like, how do you know that this psalm is older than the other psalms? And they use the fact that it has God, quote unquote, among the gods as evidence that it's older, because it fits this theory. That's how it was before. I mean, that's pretty much, honestly, with this scholarship, anything that's not orthodox is seen as true. But
In other words, there, the central claim is that we exist somewhere between the finite and the infinite.
A central claim.
A central claim is that we exist somewhere between the finite and the infinite.
No,
Is that-
I said that we were finite and we had to establish a relationship with the infinite.
Yeah, then in that case, then we're all religious, but then I can do the same thing and define one particular element of atheism. It seems like we both have a reductive view of what the other side looks like, to the point where a conversation seems incoherent, and not just incoherent, but not in the way that the average Christian understands Christianity to be.
Do you have a
Okay,
problem
let's
with...
pause there. Sorry, you've been voted out by
Awesome.
the majority.
I hope this whole thing isn't going to be like that, because that went absolutely nowhere.
Hey, how's it going?
How
Nice to meet you.
doing? Nice to meet you, too.
David.
David, good to see you.
Oh,
Tell
no
me
problem.
everything that you know
Explaining
about
things
the
is
Polynesian
one of the
deity
only
Lono,
things I'm good at.
L-O-N-O.
I don't know anything about the Polynesian deity Lono.
So you're rejecting something without knowledge of what you're rejecting.
Oh my God.
I'm not rejecting it. No
you
more
be-
than I'm
do
rejecting
you believe in
anything that
Lono?
I don't know anything about.
Do you believe in Lono?
I
Do you
fail to
believe
see
that
the
he is a
relevance of
deity that exists in the world, exists in the universe, that exists in the existence of everything? Do you believe that Lono
I'll
is
answer
a
that
being?
question once you...
I already know where this is going, and I don't know how Jordan Peterson's going to answer it, but it's based on, I don't know if it's if it is a fallacy, I don't know the name of it, but it's the, there's no middle ground between belief and unbelief. This is like what they mean when they say that atheism is the default position, because when you're born, you don't believe in a God, as if ignorance and rejection are the same thing. So he asked, do you believe in this deity? And I'm like, I've never heard of that deity. So I can't tell you whether or not I believe in him until I know something about him. I probably don't believe in that deity, but I wouldn't know that until I learn more about him. So right now I'm completely in the dark. But he's saying that, oh, you reject it without knowing about it. But like he said, like, I'm not rejecting it. I don't know about it. It's like, hey, do you like deep fried oysters? I'm like, I've never had deep fried oysters. So like, oh, so you don't like them? You say you don't like them and you never tasted them? That's sort of how the
to
argument goes.
answer my question, which is, do I reject
Yeah,
everything that I'm ignorant of? Because that's your presupposition that undergirds
Oh,
your
yeah, there we
argument.
go.
And unless
You
you
did
can
it.
prove that that's valid, then there's no point.
My question is quite simple.
Yeah, but that doesn't
Do
mean
you
it's
believe-
formulated accurately.
Do you believe that Lono
Yeah.
exists? Yes or no?
I'm not going to answer that question for the reasons I just described.
See,
You
that's the
already
first I got it.
insisted that if I reject something, that if I'm ignorant of something, I reject it. Do you think that everyone in the world has to know everything simultaneously for that to be valid and true?
I think in order for your
Answer that
argument
question.
to be true, in order for it to be true that we atheists don't understand what we're rejecting, then you need to also apply that to yourself and to Christians and to Muslims and to any other person on this earth, where if you don't understand what you're rejecting the belief in, then you can't reject the belief in it. That's the implication of your
I
claim.
didn't say that I
I'm saying he
rejected
didn't
the
freaking
belief
say
in
that.
Lono. I
It's
said I didn't
Lono.
know who Lono was. I didn't
Right.
say anything about rejecting.
That's because I've asked you several times and you haven't, but let me get to my even greater point. You're saying atheists don't understand what religion is or what God is in order to be able to reject it fully or completely. We have someone over here who studied it in their own way. I've studied religion. I have a degree in religious studies, specialty in Christianity and Mediterranean traditions. And further
That's
than that, beyond
probably
me,
worth
Pew Research
$5.
studies suggest that atheists and agnostics actually know more about religion and about religious stories, the foundational principles, than believers.
That's because they're more religious than they think they are.
Okay. You can.
They're concerned with deep matters, and one of the defining characteristics of someone who's
I would have
oriented in
to see
religious
those
direction
studies.
is that they're
I would have to see those studies. For one, atheists, more educated people, period, tend to be atheists. So that might be one reason for that. Also, there are fewer of them. So if you're more likely to get an ignorant person if you sample a bunch of believers randomly and a bunch of non-believers randomly. So even if these studies do suggest that they know more because they tend to, like Jordan Peterson, they tend to be more curious people. But they also, in my opinion, in my experience, tend to know less than Christians who are well educated, because a lot of, and this is by no means all, but I know a ton of atheists, especially those who are vocal on the internet, think that being an atheist makes them intelligent. And because of that, they feel like they know everything already. Because why wouldn't they? Because they're so smart, because they're an atheist.
concerned with deep matters.
Okay.
In fact, it's virtually definitional.
Right, but they also have to identify with a religious tradition and accept the foundational stories that go along
Well,
with
that would mean more that they're sectarian than that they're religious. And most people, for example, in the United States, deny that they're religious but accept that they're spiritual.
Let's pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.
Well, yeah, pretty much. Aha! The TikTok debates are a perfect example.
Hi,
of
nice
that.
to meet you.
How are you doing?
Especially
Good, how are
What's
you?
your name?
I'm Greg. Nice to meet
Hi,
you.
Greg.
When you, a lot of times when you ask these people during those debates why they believe what they believe, even when they start, I was going back and forth with somebody this morning on Bubba the Socks channel. He was asking me about, he was mad because I said some stuff about Dan McClellan. I basically said that he was a dishonest hack, because he is. And I told them, and they were saying that I was the hack. And I'm like, if you think I'm a hack, why don't you just if you want to challenge something I say, then go ahead. I have tons of videos. Pick a topic and challenge me on it. Why don't you pit yourself against myself instead of hiding behind this scholar that you love so much? I have plenty of scholars that I'm fans of, but I don't sick them on people when I disagree with them. I do my own research. But that's the problem. They assume that if you are religious, you are ignorant. And so they think that being an atheist gives them a leg up on you, and it makes them sloppy and it makes them lazy. It also makes them extremely annoying. And again, I'm not talking about all atheists. I'm speaking in general here.
Okay, so I feel like you're getting at this idea of polysemy, where we have multiple related meanings for a word, right? Like, for example, a famous painting can be emotionally moving in that it changes my emotional state. And when I was on the highway coming here to the studio, I was physically moving. I was changing my position. If I said, I believe the Mona Lisa is very moving, and you said, you don't really understand what you're saying, it's nailed to the wall, I would say that you're the one who doesn't understand what I'm saying, not the other way around. And the way that relates to this is there are many concepts of God, and I'll admit, I find a lot of what you say about that interesting. I'm familiar with it. The idea of this kind of Jungian hierarchical thing, or as a metaphor or a symbol, or the kind of, atheist, materialist, literalist idea of a agentic, omnipotent, omniscient being that intervenes in reality, right? So when I'm saying that I reject the concept of God, I'm aware of these other definitions of God, but I think that when we use words, we tend to only imply one meaning at a time. So the same way that I would say the Mona Lisa is moving emotionally, but I would not say it's moving physically. I would say I reject the concept of God in this very literal way. But
What literal way?
the way that God is this omniscient, omnipotent, agentic, supernatural being that sent his son down and has, caused miracles and all these things like that. The idea of God is
Do you think that there's an underlying unity of things?
Could you explain that question?
Well, scientists, for example, believe that science unifies in a comprehensive theory. Do you, yes, no, or that
I know
there are
that people-
multiple competing truths? Those are the options. Either things unify or there are multiple competing truths.
I think that I know that, for example, like in physics, people are looking for
like
like a
these
theory of
dichotomies.
everything.
And why do you think they're doing that?
It's interesting, it's helpful.
But they also believe that there's an underlying unity to things.
In a sense, yeah. Like, you mean like the material world and time and space are probably governed by universal laws and principles?
Partly that, yes, yes, but that the same thing might extend to a broader domain that would include imagination and value.
Could you help me connect that to the prompt?
Well, I'm trying to define God, the God
Yeah.
that I don't think atheists do a very good job of defining. Here's another question for you. What do you think guides you in your determination of whether or not what you're saying to me is true?
Can we go back? Can we stay on what we were talking about?
We are.
Okay.
You're just uncomfortable with the question.
No, I feel like you're just kind of throwing different spaghetti at the wall.
I'm not.
Okay.
I asked
All
you a
right.
very specific question. What is it that you think guides you when you're talking to me to help you determine whether what you say is true?
Logic, memory, reasoning, sensory information.
How do you distinguish that from being governed by something that's false?
An interesting question.
How do you know the difference when you speak between what's true and what's false? So you could
I
imagine
infer, right? I can infer. I can.
from what principles?
So, and what are you getting at?
I'm getting.
Okay, I gotta lie. I can't. I was about to say I gotta lie. I can't lie. I have not quite understood what the heck Jordan Peterson was talking about when he says that they reject God but don't understand what their rejection. I kind of understand it now, because he's basically trying to get this dude to admit that he believes in objective truth. And of course, it's very, very hard to prove there is an objective truth if you don't believe in God. So he's saying, I'm rejecting God, but I accept truth. And they're like, how can you have that without some concept of God? And so if you and you can start from the existence of truth and work your way up to God. So I think I get it now, and I think that's why this atheist dude is uncomfortable. Even though I think pointing out that somebody's uncomfortable is just going to make them defensive. So again, I like Jordan Peterson's a smart guy, but I don't think he's a very good debater. He seems too aggressive.
At the fact that your conscience guides you. Is
Okay.
that reasonable?
Conscious is defined by
Conscience.
my empathy and my reason are my foundational.
Define it any way you want.
Okay, so that's how I'm defining my conscience. Is my my conscience is my sense of
Right
and wrong. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah,
Where
yeah.
does that come from?
I would say that comes from an evolved capacity to empathize and a recognition of the benefits of engaging with and nurturing that capacity. And then that empathy is constrained and guided by reason, right? Like, for example, I am driving down the highway, there's a kitten in the road. I'm going to empathetically feel, oh my God, I want to save the kitten, but then reasonably, like, I'm going to get hit by a car, right? So that's sort of the process through which I make ethical decisions.
Okay,
is
how do
empathy
you-
constrained by reason?
Do you think that people can differ in their response to something empathically?
Yeah.
Is there a mediating principle that can tell you one person who's empathic and another person who's empathic that disagree, who's correct?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we'd have to, talk it out, right? We do that in real life all the time when we have, whether that's a discussion with a friend about the right thing to do in a situation, whether that's a policy discussion about law, right? That's where
I
we
really
can
kinda
converse
want him
with
to
each
get to
other,
the
think
point.
about things, explain
I
our
know
perspective.
these are supposed to be conversations, but I kind of want him to get to the point. This is getting, this is just dragging on, and he's already sort of gotten the dude to admit, sort of, that he believes in an objective truth. He needs to just nail whatever he's gonna nail.
Perspectives and then kind of reach a conclusion, right? That I think that we do that all the time.
So Elijah, the prophet Elijah, defined God in the Old Testament as the voice of conscience within.
Okay.
That's a definition.
So you're saying by that definition of God, I see this kind of goes back to where I'm saying initially.
I'm
where,
not defining it. Elijah
Okay,
defined
so
it.
as Elijah defines
It's
God.
defined that way in Jonah, too.
Okay, so as
Cardinal Newman also
got
defined it that
as,
way.
as I'm sure you know many people who've defined it that way, and it's impressive. You're a very knowledgeable person.
I'm not trying to be impressive. I'm
okay.
just pointing out to you
Got
how
it.
God is defined in the Old
Okay.
Testament.
All right. So to respond to that, I do think there are lots of interesting ways to define God. And that goes back to my kind of opening
Then how do we
statement.
specify what we're arguing about?
We use context clues, or again, it goes back to my example of the Mona
I'm
Lisa.
defining God as conscience.
Okay. So that's interesting, but then you're kind of expanding the meaning of
No,
God.
I'm not. That's how it's defined in the Old Testament.
Okay,
in
so-
Elijah and in Jonah.
Sure. So whoever, so some.
It's not whoever.
Okay.
Elijah is one of the
Okay.
major
All right.
Old Testament
All right.
prophets.
All
Right?
right.
He's equal in stature to Moses.
Okay.
Okay, I do think Jordan Peterson's being a little abrasive here, but I understand why he's doing it, because a lot of this floundering that the atheists do, it's to it's to paint the idea of God as nebulous. This is something that they do a lot. It's when you say that, oh well, this is what the Bible says, they'll be like, oh well, that's what your interpretation of the Bible is, without doing anything to tell me why my interpretation of the Bible is incorrect, or that why there can be no correct interpretation. It's just a way of muddying the waters. And it makes it easier for them, because I can say, oh, this is why I believe in nothing, because you can prove nothing. So if you can prove nothing, believing in nothing makes me right, even though you can't prove that either. And so I do think he's being a little too abrasive here, but I also like the fact that he's kind of holding their feet to the fire and saying like, no, this is what I'm doing. This is what it is. Don't try to muddy the water. Don't try to skirt around it. Like you have to face what I'm actually saying.
Right. So it's not arbitrary.
All right. So that is interesting, but it's not relevant to the context with which I am using the term God.
It's directly relevant. Atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting. You accept conscience as a guide, and conscience is one of the defining characteristics of God in the Old Testament.
I think you're being intellectually disingenuous.
In what way?
Because, again,
I asked you if you believe that conscience guided you.
You just asked me a question, and then you stopped me from answering it. In this setting, you understand the way I am using the term God and belief.
Not in the least. I don't understand how you're using it in the least. That's why I'm trying to define it. My definition of God as conscience is a lot more precise and oriented than your definition of the God that you hypothetically disbelieve in.
It's irrelevant to the fault lines of this debate.
How is it irrelevant?
Because in common parlance, when we're talking about atheist, God, belief, not belief,
I don't care about common parlance. I'm trying to get to something fundamental.
I think your point is irrelevant to the way that people tend to use these words. Your point that there are these polysemous
I didn't make
ideas
that
of God.
point. You did.
I
made a specific point that God was associated with conscience.
I just feel like you kind of retreat into this semantic fog.
I'm not retreating at all. I'm advancing, sir. You are retreating.
All right. Well, it was very nice to meet you. I appreciate the conversation.
Yeah. It's very brave of you to do this. My next claim is that morality and purpose cannot be found within science.
Oh, well, that's just true. And I hope this one seems like it'll be a little bit more interesting.
What is up, Mr. Canada?
How you doing, man?
I'm doing great.
What's
How are
your
you?
name?
Brian. I think it's interesting that you say that morality and purpose can't be found in science. Actually,
No, within science.
sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Purpose, I actually grant you, because purpose is subjective, right? Unless you want to boil it down to the purpose of life is just to procreate, right? Sure, whatever. Morality is actually something that we do see. We actually have examples of Neanderthals, an older individual was found in a tribe, missing an arm, missing teeth, still alive somehow in his 40s, 50s, right? Typically, you're a Neanderthal, you can't eat, you can't hunt, you die. Right, but we know that members of his...
Neanderthals are human. So that doesn't say anything. To say that older humans had morality, so we can find it with science, that doesn't mean anything.
Tribe were taking care of him, right? So we know that at some level, early in our evolutionary history, we actually developed altruism. We have examples of chimpanzees who actually have a basic understanding of fairness, right? If you give a chimpanzee 2 grapes, right, and his buddy gets 3, right? He actually freaks out, right? But you give both chimps 3 grapes and they're good. We have examples of parrots.
Except for the greedy chimps.
Except for the greedy chimps.
They want 4 grapes.
They want 4 grapes. You know, those do exist, right? But we have similar examples where we do animal tests, right? And
so morality is in...
He missed the point of that when he said the greedy chimps want 4 grapes. We find greed to be immoral. Does the greedy chimp who wants 4 grapes think, yeah, I know I'm being greedy? Or do the other chimps who have the 3 grapes think, well, that chimp is greedy? Or do they just have this thing in their brain that says they're not getting what I'm getting? That's what he's trying to get. Like, is that morality, or is that just advanced selfishness?
Intrinsic.
I think...
So it precedes science.
I think that actually
right?
a better way to define it would be that social animals, which we are, right, require some...
Why is this dude's face so greasy? I'm just looking, it's like, dude, you are shiny.
Level of morality or...
Into what? I'm not disagreeing.
Sure.
Why do they require
Maybe it's
that?
hot in there.
Because it's the only way that social groups can actually survive, right?
That's my point with
Sure.
regards to science. Thank you very much.
Is that
Precisely the point that you just made, that science has to exist within a moral framework that isn't in itself scientific.
how's that not scientific?
Well, because it's not derived from the scientific process, as you just
It
indicated.
doesn't need
by
to derive
pointing
from the
to-
scientific process.
Well,
It's
hang
the
on,
fact that
hang on a sec.
we are social animals, and we need that to exist as a group.
I
right?
agree, but
Sure.
you pointed to the morality of Neanderthals, to the morality of chimpanzees. They didn't derive that from science.
They don't need to. That's not how
That's
that
my
works.
point.
Science explains it.
That's his
So you-
point.
No, science doesn't explain morality.
It doesn't explain how social animals would need to be.
Well, that's a
altruistic.
complicated question.
Is it? But we see it though.
Yeah, but
Well, it doesn't explain how they would need. It can explain why they would need morality, but you can't possibly prove scientifically that morality is needed. That morality is needed to survive. At least not over the amount of time that you would say that we developed morality. That is 100% not a scientific thing. That is a hypothesis. I'll say, to be generous. It's a guess. It's not something that's been observed. Most certainly not something that's been observed. Because at the end of the day, morality is internal. So you would have to observe somebody's thoughts, because a psychopath could do what they feel is beneficial to them without feeling at all that they are morally obligated to do it. So, yeah, that doesn't prove anything.
explaining the evolution of morality and explaining morality itself aren't the same thing.
Okay, so you're asking why does this happen?
Yes, that's more accurate.
Because we're social animals and we
Yeah,
need
but there's
to be.
more to it than that.
Is there?
Sure. For example, so we're moral animals that have a sense of the future.
Sure.
Okay, that makes us unique, and that structures our morality.
No, actually, there are other animals that can predict the future, or not,
Not
predict
really.
the future. No, tigers. Actually, there was a tiger at the SF Zoo that killed somebody, and so
Hunting
it actually.
animals.
No. Kids threw shit at the tiger. The tiger actually plotted its escape, and it found the
I'm not
kids.
saying that animals can't think.
Okay,
No, but
let's
they can
pause
perceive
here.
the future.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Well-
Voted out by the majority.
Thank you, man.
Good man. Yeah.
I would say I kind of wish they had more time, but then I kind of don't. because-
How you
How
doing?
you doing, man?
My name's Luke. Nice to meet
Good
you.
to see you, Luke.
So your claim that morality and purpose can only be found in science is a little shaky, because I think that your claim is really being framed to be morality and purpose can only be found in religion. Is that how you're kind of framing it?
That's not what he
I would
frickin'
say
said.
that the domain of religion is the domain of morality and purpose. Yes,
Okay.
exactly. And also that science is actually structured, at least in part technically, to eliminate such considerations from its purview a priori.
Okay.
Right? That's why we define science as value free.
Mm-hmm.
But that has to be wrong, because scientists have to prioritize their attention
Mm-hmm.
towards something before they can even engage in observation.
Okay.
And that act of prioritization of attention is a value predicated act. And so I can continue. There's all sorts of things we have to assume
Yeah.
about science before it can take place.
Okay, so what I'm specifically pointing out here is about religion in particular, since you yourself are a Christian, right?
People debate about that, and I generally don't discuss it publicly.
Okay, I understand
Mm-hmm.
that. And me, myself, I am a former young earth creationist fundamentalist.
Oh, yeah.
So I have experience in this. I used to run a TikTok channel directed about apologetics about the Bible specifically.
Oh man, you gotta love the "I used to be an apologist" people. I always think that's funny, because it's like, yeah, I used to be a Christian apologist. I'm like, I'm definitely not gonna listen to you, because how the heck were you so bad at apologetics that you couldn't even convince yourself?
In this type of facet with morality, evolution and such, and going back and forth with that. So in the Bible, it talks a lot about slavery, right?
Yes.
Yes. So in that, it teaches you
No, it talks about slavery. It doesn't talk a lot about slavery. Slavery is mentioned a few times, but whatever.
how to take care of a slave. Rather than saying slavery's wrong, I think
No,
it
it
should
says
say
that in the story of Moses.
It says slavery is incorrect. It says
Well,
it's immoral.
that's why Moses leads his people away from slavery.
But why does the Bible predicate and tell people exactly how to take care of a slave? Isn't
Well,
that immoral? Wouldn't you say that culturally we've evolved as a species, as he said earlier about empathy?
Yeah, I would say that
His whole issue right now is that where is he getting the idea that slavery is wrong? Before Christianity, nobody thought slavery was wrong. So he's saying that we evolved as a culture, but if that is embedded in Christianity, it's oh, did he just try to change the question shit to burden of proof? Yes, he did. They kind of do that a lot, actually. It goes to, and I can see them doing this with Jordan Peterson because it's hard to even understand his arguments and the way he frames them sometimes. But yeah, it happens a lot. They will say, okay, this is what they do all the time. And again, not talking all atheists, but like these internet types, especially him, because he said he was a former apologist. You will say something, and there are things that they expect you to say as a Christian. If you don't say what they expect you to say, they don't think on their feet. One thing you got to understand is that most people are not that smart. The average IQ is 100. Half of people are lower than that. So most people are not that smart, even if they think they are. So what they have in their mind is sort of this flow chart of what you're going to say. So they'll say something like, for example, Paul didn't actually write his letters. And I believe that Paul did write his letters. But if you say, oh, I agree with that. I don't think Paul wrote this letter and that letter. But anyway, what they'll do then is they'll have to shift the conversation to something else that they know about, because you just threw off their whole game by not saying what they expected you to say. They have these preconceived arguments. They can't think on their feet. And so Jordan Peterson kind of went into it on this, but yeah.
The reason we evolved, so to speak, away from slavery was because the West was founded on Judeo-Christian morality and the presumption that every person was made in the image of God. And so slavery itself became immoral, and that was established by Protestant Christians in the UK, who then convinced the UK government for 200 years to go to war on slavery.
And wouldn't you say that this is about the cultural evolution of humans in general, rather than just Christianity?
No, I think it's the flowering of the ideas that were embedded in the biblical text.
Yeah, because, I mean, there were other cultures that were evolving around the world, and they were still cool with slavery. It was Christians that went around the world and ended slavery, even in other parts, like in Africa and in the Middle East. It was like British blockades that were doing that. So if it was just like human evolution in general, then you would have seen it ending like by itself. And that didn't happen in most places. And even now today, there are places that still have slavery. And are you going to go around and say that these cultures are inferior? I think they are. But I think sort of people like this aren't usually willing to say that.
Across long spans of time.
I feel like this is just humans editing based on the cultural evolution of morality.
What do you mean by just?
Just?
Yeah, just humans.
Well, humans.
Editing.
Well, based on culture and history, right? We get better.
Well, they did do it based on culture and history, but culture and history have their foundations too. So.
Well, yeah, but we're talking about slavery. So many people bolstered
but
it
they based on their anti-slavery arguments on the Bible. If they're basing their anti-slavery arguments on the Bible, then it doesn't make any sense to then turn around and say that they're putting them into the Bible when they're getting them out of the Bible. But okay.
They looked at it and they justified it in the United States and the Deep South. They justified slavery.
Yeah, but
based
the main thrust of Protestant thought in particular was stringently against slavery, and it was about the only movement in the history of the human race that had an anti-slavery direction.
Which was driven by humans and their understanding
that's one
of
way
morality.
Of looking at it. Well, it depends.
It's the same with women's suffrage. I mean, women's in the patriarchy.
What do you mean it was driven by humans? Humans drove slavery too.
Yes, exactly.
So there's no argument there. If slavery and anti-slavery were both driven by humans, what does your claim that they were driven by humans have to do with it?
Evolving morality based on the culture that within the society that they live in.
Okay, fine.
So with women's suffrage as well is a very similar topic.
But I'm saying the culture is Christian. He's saying it's based on the culture that they lived in, but the culture is Christian. He himself is the one who moved it to this idea that, oh, well, it's found in the frame of religion. Yeah, it is. And so when the culture has Christianity as its religion, its morality improves. So it's kind of just proving his point for him.
In the Bible, there are denominations in Christianity, such as Pentecostal movement, which do bolster women to be pastors, right? Which I think that's a great thing to do. But most like to disregard women.
Where do you think the idea that human beings were sufficiently equal to all vote and not be slaves came from?
Humans.
Yeah, but so did the idea of slavery.
So did the
that's
idea of God.
Fine, but what's your
Yes.
point? Like, you're not making an argument. You're just saying all thoughts come from humans,
Yes.
regardless of the thoughts.
It's not driven by a higher power. It's driven on our experiences
Define
as
higher.
humans, which is what is best for all people.
Is it driven by conscience?
It could be. Which conscious is also something that has evolved over time, and I think that's
What's
something
the
that does evolve with in
Yeah,
morality
what is
and
the
empathy.
evidence of that?
Okay,
Now he's just
I don't
saying
understand the
stuff
point
with
that you're
no
making.
My
evidence
point is
whatsoever.
that God influenced slavery. People looked at the Bible and went, "This is moral because God says so." Just like women's suffrage,
There's lots
and
of
just like homosexuality.
all human societies were slave owning, so you
Yes.
can't blame that on the Bible.
if humanity decided,
Oh wait, address that first.
Slavery
What?
All
predates the
human
Bible.
societies were slavers, so you can't blame that on the Bible.
well, you can say it bolstered it.
Well, not if you look at the broad sweep of history, because it was the Protestant Christians
based
in
on
the
their
UK.
interpretation of the Bible,
It was the Protestant Christians.
which
in-
evolves over time.
Let's pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.
All right. Well, it was great talking
Yeah,
with you,
nice
sir.
talking to you too.
Yes.
I'm kind of ready for the next claim.
Dr. Peterson?
Good to see you, man.
Pleasure.
He's gonna
What's your
keep
name?
taking-
Brian. So the first thing I would like to say is I would like to engage in this discussion in a symbiotic manner. I would not like to engage where there is one clear winner and one clear loser.
Oh my God,
Emotions
shut
are activated and it ultimately comes about ego. So I'm just saying I'm really trying to understand your position.
Oh my God, we got Bizarro Jordan Peterson out of here. We about to have a freaking word salad buffet.
And I would just like you to really try to understand my position.
Deal.
Okay, sounds good. With that, if you're saying that morality and purpose cannot come from science, is the opposite of that true, that morality and purpose can only come from God?
That's not the opposite.
That's a way of defining it, yes.
Okay.
That's right, that's good. So I would say that with regard to the first claim, say, atheists don't understand what they're rejecting, because I would say by definition, God is the unity upon which moral claims are based. That's
Okay.
a definition, right?
Okay, if there is a God, what is the purpose of life?
Well, in
the
the
heck
Christian
kind of question
tradition, the
is that?
purpose of life is
Okay. Even if, obviously, if there is a God, then life has a purpose. Then you need God to give life purpose. But it does not follow at all that we know exactly what the purpose of life is. Of course, the purpose of life is to glorify God, but still, that's a crazy question.
To
And
engage in
I'm wondering what it has
voluntary,
to do.
upward, self-sacrifice, so that the kingdom of heaven can be established on earth.
So you're trying to make it to heaven and avoid hell.
Yes, that's a good way of
How the
thinking.
hell-
What is the purpose of heaven? Do you understand?
Well,
so here's the deal.
hold on a second. Hold on. Yeah, he did do it again. That it's sort of like the go-to strategy. But hold on a second. Did you see that? He said it is for us to engage in upward self-sacrifice so that the kingdom of God can be established on earth. And he was like, "Oh, so you don't want to go to hell?" Did you even hear anything I just said? And that's the thing, because that's the idea that he had in his mind, that you are trying to go to heaven and avoid hell. So no matter what he says, except I'm not trying to avoid heaven, that's what he's going to get out of it.
At
We
minimum,
get
it's
into
the
an
opposite
infinite.
of endless suffering. How about
We
that?
can, okay, and so should we not try to achieve infinite suffering on planet Earth? And if we can achieve infinite suffering on planet Earth
mean
without
avoid it?
God,
I'm about to say, I don't think we
avoiding
should
it,
try
if
to
we can do
achieve
that
infinite
without
suffering.
God, then does that defeat your claim?
Well, yeah, except that it doesn't. You circumvented my initial definition, because I said that by definition, God was the unified source of morality.
And you can't
And so
do
if we
that
engage in a
anyway.
moral exercise,
I know I keep pausing this. I'm not going to pause it so much anymore. But you can't do that anyway. Because how could you achieve infinite anything without God? We are finite. So that doesn't make any sense.
When you're talking about morality, though, when you really reverse engineer it and you get it down to its root, you're a psychologist.
Yeah.
It really seems like it just has to deal with motivation. People are saying there is a God, there
it's
is
more specific than that.
Well, so let me ask you this. So if there is a God and there is a moral code and it doesn't come at your benefit, are you going to follow it?
It depends on how you define your benefit. If you define your benefit,
if it's going to come at your expense, would you still
Define
follow
your
it?
expense.
If God came down and said, here is my moral code and you should follow it, but even if you follow it, you are still going to end up in hell, are you going to follow it?
well, that was the question that was put to Job and to Christ, right? Because they were required. Hang on, I'm answering your question. They were required to withstand trials that would break anyone and maintain their upward orientation regardless.
And they did that with the motivation of believing that this omnipotent, all-loving God.
Because the human body is finite, the soul is infinite. Here's the thing: if you look at the word soul as it's used in Scripture, like specifically that word nephesh, it refers to the whole person. So having a body, and you actually won't find a distinction between you will find a distinction between body and soul, but basically the soul is the whole of you. So yes, if your body is not the whole of you, but your soul is, how do I put this? Oh, actually, I don't even have to say all that. Your soul can be destroyed. So it's not necessarily infinite, because God has the power to destroy body and soul in hell, and your soul didn't always exist. So your soul has a beginning and it can have an end. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the soul is infinite. Especially if there's no God, because he was saying if we can do it without God. If there's no God, your soul is definitely not infinite. Your soul will only last a few years.
Somehow turn it into a benefit, so they still did it solely for their benefit. So
No,
when you,
not well.
yes,
Let's
they
define.
did. Yes,
hang
they
on,
did.
hang on.
If-
Let's define benefit. Like, if I did something for your sister, would that be to your
I'm trying to
benefit?
figure out what the heck
Like,
he's getting
how are
at.
you defining your benefit? Do you mean one of your whims gratified now? Or do you mean you and everyone you love and know over some reasonable span of time? Like,
So
what do you mean by you?
when you're talking about whims, I think you're talking about something that's more dopamine. When you're talking about morality, you're talking about something that's more serotonin and more ultimately satisfying. So you and I agree on a lot. I mean, when it comes to talking about how men should be masculine and things of that nature, you and I are 100% in agreement. We just don't agree on the justification that God is the only thing that provides morality.
It's not a justification, it's a definition.
What's the difference then between a definition and a justification? I mean, it's ultimately psychologically the same thing.
Well, we have to define what we're talking about before we can debate.
Okay, well,
right?
so here's my
I
position.
said that God, among other things.
I'm actually a non-theist. I'm not an atheist. I believe the human condition is one of uncertainty. And what that means is that I don't believe that you can conclude there is a God with certainty, and I don't believe that you can conclude that there is a God without in the same position. Now, with that, I don't care. I still wake up every day and I have motivation to be a moral person.
Define moral.
Moral, what I ought to do.
Okay, and how do you come to that conclusion?
And what I ought to do, ultimately it comes down to what not just benefits me, but what benefits the entire planet, what benefits the entire system. I think that your entire moral perspective comes from linear thinking, and when you look at the reality of the universe, it's actually more so holistic. So when you look at how Aristotle defined God, when he said that there had to be an unmoved moved or an uncaused cause, he was defining God from a linear perspective, and you do the same with morality, and you do the same with purpose.
How does my definition of morality? How does my definition of morality hypothetically differ from yours?
Because you're saying that there's something that exists in a vacuum, that it exists in and of itself, and nothing in the universe exists in a vacuum. Nothing exists in and of itself. It's a whole systems-based morality. It's a systems-based reality.
Is there a hierarchical
and that is
structure?
what the quantum.
Is there a hierarchical structure? Are some things more important than others?
Are some things, I think some things lead to more benefits than others.
Then, by your own definition, some things are more important than others.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay,
What is
pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.
Dang, why is this claim so long?
How you doing?
Nice to meet you.
This one is super
I
long.
guess since you said morality and purpose cannot be found in science, It would just depend on like what you're referencing. If you're saying a description of your psychological preferences would be considered within science, sure. But I don't think that you have to say that it comes from science in order to be like an atheist. As an agnostic atheist, I don't know if God exists and I don't believe that a God exists. And the only ones that I would really reject would be like the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, perfect notion of God that plenty of Christians like prescribe themselves. So I guess
How is that relevant to this claim?
you're basing a position of morality and purpose in some like notion of God that isn't the same type of notion of God that typical Christians would prescribe. Your notion of God is
What typical Christians?
yeah, typically when I talk to Christians, they say that they believe in an
How
all-knowing.
about Cardinal Newman, who defined God as conscience? He's a major influence on all of Catholic social theory.
What these people don't seem to get, and this is another example of moving it away from what he's saying to moving it to what they know. They have to come up with what they believe is the definition of the Judeo-Christian God, without getting into this more nebulous stuff. Nothing that Jordan Peterson is saying is incompatible with Christian beliefs. None of it. But they need to reduce it to just like the bare bones basics, because once you get into the more heady philosophical stuff that Jordan Peterson is talking about, then they can't defend it. Probably because they've never thought about it, because they're used to arguing on the internet.
How about that, Christian?
At least that's what I think. I don't
Sure.
know who any of
So
these
do you
people
believe
are.
in the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good notion of God?
What do you mean by believe?
Do you think it to be true?
Oh my God. I hate
That's
that.
the circular definition. What do you mean
How
when
is
you
that
say you
circular?
believe?
How is that circular?
Because you added no content to the answer by substituting the word true and believe.
I said you think it to be true.
All right. So if
What's
you
a belief?
believe something, you stake your life on it.
What do you mean by that?
You live for it and you die for it. That's what I mean by that. It isn't something that you say. It isn't something that's associated with logical consistency. It's not declarative. It's not propositional. It's not a figment of your imagination. It's the presupposition of your attention and your action. And you're either fragmented, in which case you worship multiple gods, or there's some unity at the bottom of it that makes you an unstoppable force.
Okay, so you're saying that you don't believe something if you wouldn't die for it?
Not really, no.
Okay. So then,
How would you define belief? Something you say?
Can I explain? Like, I could believe it is the case that this pen exists, but if someone like threatened my life, right, I would lie in order to be able to save my life, right? Like, I think you would do that too. You wouldn't lie to save your
Don't
life?
be so sure.
You wouldn't lie to save your life?
How much do you know about me? I didn't lie to save my career. I didn't lie to save my clinical practice.
Would you lie to like save your children, your mom, your dad?
I don't think lying would save them.
No, can there ever be a circumstance logically that lying could save someone?
Yeah, and if you're steeped in sin, you're likely to live in circumstances like that.
I'll give you an example. If you're like in like Nazi Germany, and it is the
Nah,
case that
he's
there's like
getting a
Jewish
little
people
too
in your
deep.
attic and you're trying
I
to
know
protect
the
them,
example.
would you lie to like the Nazis? If
I
they're
would have
asking?
done everything I bloody well could so I wouldn't be in that situation
you
to begin
lie?
with. It's a hypothetical and it's
You
not
can't answer
answerable.
hypotheticals?
No, I can't answer a hypothetical like
Why?
that because
Did
it's
you eat
far.
today?
Look,
Did you eat
don't
today?
play games.
I'm not playing a game. I'm just
Yes,
asking if
you
you ate
are.
it.
If you present me with an intractable moral choice that's stripped of context and you back me into a corner, you're playing game. I just told you
Hypothetical.
I would do everything that I could to make sure that I'm never in that situation. By the time you've got there, you've made so many mistakes that there's nothing you can do that isn't a sin.
Being born in Nazi Germany and trying to protect people that you care about, like there could be a Jewish friend that you have and you want to protect them.
I think you should
have
just
them in
give
your
up on
attic.
that line of questioning.
Give up on just like trying to clarify your position? Because you
I
don't
did
like, are you like
clarify.
uncomfortable with me asking this question? It's just a basic hypothetical. Like I could ask
It's
you.
just a basic
yeah, yeah.
hypothetical
Like, you
where you
like if you-
put Jews' lives at stake in Nazi Germany. That's just a basic hypothetical.
Obviously, you would lie in that scenario to save their life, but you're like not trying to answer this question for some reason.
I just told you why.
Are you anti-fascist?
Oh,
so you're
why are
anti-fascist?
you
get
asking
him the
that?
heck out
I was just
of
asking, just clarifying. But like, okay, again, you're not answering this hypothetical because you know it shows that you clearly would lie to.
He was trying to get it on video asking Jordan Peterson if he was anti-fascist and him not answering the question so he could say that Jordan Peterson is a freaking Nazi.
Save
I'm
someone's life.
answering it in
Obviously,
a
that's
manner
not what
you
truth
don't
is.
find acceptable.
Obviously, because I care about
you're-
truth.
I wouldn't be in that scenario.
Obviously, right? Logically, because that's
No.
already happened. Like that's in the past. You don't have a time travel device. We're bringing this logical hypothetical up to show you that in some circumstances that do happen within the real world, you would lie to save people's lives. So your definition of truth isn't actually how we're typically using it. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to muddy the waters when I ask you, like, do you believe this? Do you think this to be true? So you don't actually have to answer the questions. And plenty of Christians don't like that because they clearly see that you don't really like want to be associated with
I can
Christianity with that
imagine
respect.
that I was in a situation where
Yeah, I have to say, I do think Jordan Peterson is avoiding the question, but I do also think that the dude is just wasting time. That's probably why they're trying to vote him out, because he's searching for a gotcha. He's trying to win something. He's not even trying to answer the question. And I'm mad at Jordan Peterson for going down this stupid rabbit hole, because he's not. Like, this entire segment is freaking pointless, and this video is an hour and a half
the best
long.
I could do as a consequence of my previous mistakes was to tell the least amount of lie I could manage. But that would likely indicate that I had made all sorts of catastrophic errors on my way there.
So you would lie to save someone's life. So again, you do believe it to be true in that circumstance, even though you lied in that scenario. So
Not
clearly that's
without
not what
the
you see to be true.
context that I put it in.
You were not willing to
I
die for it.
said-
You were not willing to let other people die for it. So that's not what you see to be true then, seemingly.
You're doing exactly what I said you were doing at the beginning of the conversation. You're generating an impossible, restricted, hypothetical with no precursors to back me into a
How's
corner.
it possible? Is there something contradictory about it? Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too. My next claim is that everybody worships something, including atheists, even though they might not know.
Oh, that's absolutely true. That's 1,000% true. I don't know how they're gonna try to
Good work.
redefine
Thank you.
worship to get around
I'm Zena.
this.
So I want to start off with like defining terms.
Yep.
How do you define worship?
Prioritize.
Prioritize. So almost like having a preference over something rather than the
It's a
other.
hierarchy of preferences.
Yeah.
And you use it to direct your attention.
Right.
So whatever you're attending to, you're worshiping.
Right. So I've kind of become a little bit familiar with your idea of like this value-laden hierarchy.
Yeah.
Right. And you kind of posit that at the bottom of this hierarchy, or you call it top or bottom, I
Yeah,
suppose.
right.
At the bottom of this hierarchy, this foundational priority in your life is going to be considered God.
That's
is that
right.
correct?
Yes.
Right. I'm trying to imagine a situation in which could there be that someone has a priority at their foundation that is different from someone else's?
Okay, her face looks super greasy too, so I think it's just the lights and the makeup.
Oh, definitely.
Right. So we can have different conceptions of God.
That's why we fight.
Right. So essentially, there's not one God, but there are multiple gods, and these gods exist in some realm of truth. It's true that this person has one God and it exists.
Yeah, probably better to think about it as multiple values, but that there's a hierarchy of values with something at the bottom.
Right. But at the
Or
bottom is
top.
God, and there
That's
are
a definition, yeah.
Yeah. So at the bottom is God, and
Yeah.
there can be multiple people with different conceptions of God, and they're each valid and being called God. So there are multiple gods that exist.
It depends on what you mean by valid. So far, so good, but it depends on what you mean by valid, because I would say that some foundational conceptions don't play out when they're implemented. So if you put the wrong thing at the foundation, you end up in hell, for example. That's what happens in totalitarian states.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're saying
So they're not all equal. Like, all foundational principles are not equal, even
Right.
though they might be equally foundational, right?
So what makes one kind of foundational tenet like better than another one?
That's an excellent question. Iterability. Imagine that you play a game with someone and you're a kid.
Part of the problem is JVP doesn't like deriving general truths from hypothetical scenarios. I mean, I get that. I get that too, especially because a lot of times, especially in situations like this, the hypothetical is just used as a gotcha. And that's exactly what the dude was doing, because he said, this is what I believe, this is what I think. And so the guy literally tries to conjure up a extremely unlikely scenario in which case that might not be true. And it's like, if I can do that, now I got you. It's extremely dishonest, and nobody wins in that situation. That's why I don't like that he even entertained it for a little while, because in that situation,
And it's fun. So then you can play again and again and again.
So
Well, then
repetition.
It's playability across multiple iterations. So then you have a friend And a friend is better than having a game,
So-
right? So that's one. Breadth of application is another. So if it's just for me now, it's not as good as something that would be benefit to both of us across time.
Right. So we're explaining like characteristics that can be applied to like these types of like foundational values. But why is it that this iterability makes it better? And what does better mean?
Well, one hallmark of better is likely to be selected voluntarily. So
Right.
it's invitational.
Another descriptive kind of quality. So we're talking about characteristics that in some type of system with a goal, an output being like, we could maybe say happiness, right? Or some type of
Harmony.
harmony,
Yeah,
right?
that's better. Not
Base-
happiness precisely, because it's too short term.
Exactly. So as someone who is an atheist, right, I can explain that within a system, there are things that we can see as better or worse to meet this goal or meet this output. But what we're interested in, though, is what could make these things, regardless of any system, right?
Well, imagine that you set up a system and you implement it, and it produces the opposite results to which you intend. Oh yeah, that's not a good system.
Exactly.
Right, so the foundational principles are lacking because when you implement them, the game degenerates instead of moving towards the aim.
Right.
Okay,
So we're talking about
okay.
within a system. When we talk about something being moral, right, just absolutely moral, it means that without a system, right, this thing is simply moral with no reason. Like, stance independent, this thing is good. So I'm trying to figure out if such thing can exist. And if so, do you believe that these things are moral in of themselves, like self-evidently moral, or are they moral in accordance with the system?
I can't define them any more accurately than I already did, really.
Okay. In regards to morality, when we talk about the divine, when we talk about God and religion, these moral tenets and religion, right, and God exists as good because it is God, right? So it's self-evident, right? Without any kind of goal or output, this thing is good. So I want to figure out how.
There's an element of that that's true. So, for example, in the story of Job, Job is unfairly tortured in consequence of a bet between God and Satan. And so Job is emblematic of someone who's being hurt for no apparent reason. Okay, so Job's response to that is that he refuses to lose faith in himself, and he refuses to lose faith in the ultimate goodness of being. Okay, and those are axiomatic decisions. They're not exactly evidence dependent because he is suffering. There's an arbitrariness in that that's reminiscent of what you claim.
So I'm essentially trying to figure out, do you believe that something can be good, like stance independently, something that can be good?
I don't know what you mean by stance independent.
Okay, so
you
I
mean
mean
independent of people?
Independent of people, we can use that, or more so, I want to be more specific. Something that can be good, right, regardless of any end goal. It's just good.
No, I think good is tied up with goal.
Goal, okay, I completely agree. So in a sense, this is why.
That's why the religious goal in Christianity is the establishment of the kingdom of heaven on earth. It's goal dependent.
Okay, right.
So it's in reference to a goal.
So,
or the goal would be the
but
imitation of Christ.
Someone's goal, right, can be something that doesn't encompass being in congruence.
Muted. What happened? You're freaking kidding me. All right. That's great. That's wonderful. Are you serious? Well, that's fun. That's great. Let's see if I can fix it. And let's see if everybody goes away in the meantime. Boom. How are we now? Okay. Okay, cool. Goodness gracious.
With God, or
Great.
being with God.
No, the thing that they want to be incongruent.
right, okay.
Hang
It
on
is
a
God.
second. That's right. That's
Sorry,
right.
sorry,
That's
sorry.
right. That's good. That's
Myself.
great. The
This
thing
is
they want to
literally
be
the first live
incongruent
stream I've ever
with
done
is
on YouTube.
fundamentally equivalent to
So-
their
So
God.
It's
what
actually
makes
been
someone
less
a
buggy
Christian
than
and
I
what makes someone
expected.
not a Christian? What makes like that's what I'm trying to figure out because
That's a good question.
yes.
Yeah, well,
you.
probably the deepest answer to that is willingness to shoulder your cross voluntarily.
Give this girl 5 years, she'll be a Christian. She's like barely an atheist. I don't hear any atheism in the stuff that she's saying.
And trudge uphill regardless of circumstances.
Okay, so someone can have a God because in your definition, your first preference, that is God, right? So someone can believe in God, right? And not be a Christian, right?
Yeah, well, there's a statement that Christ makes in the Gospels. He says, not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven.
So not that they're even saying that they believe in God, but they just...
No, but that's why I'm saying this to you, is that Christ himself points out that there's a difference between people who say they believe and people who act it out. And the fundamental issue is the action rather than the stated belief.
But he also says that, to be saved, right, you must believe God has died for your sins or that God has resurrected in some way. So it's like, I don't necessarily think that we can take from the Bible and say that like acting in accordance with God necessarily means, or acting in accordance with, the principles of God, like for example, sacrifice, like you talk about, means that you are Christian. I don't see how you can get that from that interpretation and then, kind of justify it as the truth.
I don't
not
think
Christian,
that
you
the
won't
fact
act
that
in
you
accordance with
sacrifice
the
is sufficient to
principles.
make you Christian.
So can we repeat once again what you believe makes someone Christian?
There's many things, but one of the most fundamental is that you believe that the cosmos itself is founded on the principle of voluntary self-sacrifice. Best founded. Let me offer you a contrary example. So I could assume that power rules. And so that my assumption would be, if I can make you do it, I win. Right, and I can found a whole society on that, and that happens a lot, by the way. And that's also how societies tend to degenerate. And so that would be a society that was founded on the principle that you get to sacrifice and I don't have to. Right, now the contrary to that would be something like you give up voluntarily and with courage all the things you need to situate yourself properly in relationship to the future and other people. Right. So then there's a harmony. That's why I talked about harmony earlier.
So you navigate your life, right, in accordance kind of to this principle of self-sacrifice. Can I say it in that way?
Yes, you can definitely say it that way. That's exactly right. And navigate is the right term.
So someone does not have to have any awareness of Christ, of the story of Jesus, but let's say 60% of their actions, right, or more, whatever kind of metric you want to use, are in line with this self-sacrificial.
The Christian thinkers of the Middle Ages dealt exactly with that problem when they were talking about the pre-Christian philosophers, for example. And they noted the similarity, let's say, between pre-Christian Greek thought and later Christian thought, and presumed that there were moral actors outside the Christian domain.
Right. So is that person Christian, though? Is that person Christian?
To some degree, again, that's a matter of definition, because they wouldn't be proclaiming Christian propositions, but they're acting out the pattern. Right. So you imagine that full Christianity would involve a dozen things. And you can imagine someone who knows nothing of Christianity, say, acting out 8 of them.
Right.
So then they'd be 8/12 Christian or something like that.
Christian.
Well,
but to be like a full Christian, how can someone say I am Christian? Like I am Christian, not 8/12, but Christian.
Well, I hesitate to do that personally, because I think it's the kind of goal that you be very careful about proclaiming.
I don't remember who said this, but somebody said there was ever only one true Christian, and that was Christ. Because he is the one who lived out. None of us have grown up into the full stature of Christ, as Paul would put it. That's what sanctification is for. So in a sense, you would think there won't be any real Christians. Oh, it was Nietzsche. Okay. Yeah, you can think there won't be any real Christians until, basically on this side of glory. But that's just my perspective.
The technical.
But belief is not necessarily, to be mostly Christian, belief is not necessary. 8/12s or, right?
Well, it depends on what you mean by belief. See, because I would say.
Also, fun fact, I learned how to spell Nietzsche's name from Epic Rap Battles of History.
That acting out the pattern is the deepest form of belief. Now, you could add to that what you say. So, maybe in the optimal situation, how you act and what you imagine and what you say, they're the same, right? But you can imagine a hypocrite who says all sorts of wonderful things and does nothing, and you could imagine another person who acts in a very positive manner but proclaims nothing.
So what I'm kind of seeing is like a descriptive, a really comprehensive but descriptive analysis of human action, human thought, and by which we can characterize people and put people in boxes. But I don't see...
Why in boxes?
Like, when I say in boxes, I mean like I can categorize you based on your actions, not based on necessarily what you say, but based on your actions that you are more so or less so Christian, right? Things like that, right? So we can categorize people as Christian.
Well, I would say more or less voluntarily self-sacrificing.
But that's also what we came to, though, is that someone can be like 60% or 70% Christian based on simply just acting in that way.
Yeah, Richard Dawkins is like that.
I watched that debate.
Let's pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.
Very good.
Thank you so much.
They did not talk about that prompt at all. Like, not at all. It was interesting, but they didn't talk about it at all.
Hey, Dr. Peterson.
How you doing?
Danny, nice to meet you.
What's your name?
Danny.
Danny.
You're saying atheists worship things or people or places, whatever.
This guy was in the intro to this video. He was a douche.
Can you be very clear about your definition of worship again?
Attend to, prioritize, and sacrifice for.
Okay, that's it. That's your understanding of worship.
Well, I could flesh it out, but that'll do for the time we have.
Okay. Do Catholics attend to Mary?
Yes.
Okay. So do they fit that description of worship?
Yes.
So you would say Catholics and other people that revere Mary, like the Eastern Orthodox tradition, worship Mary.
Well, they might not put her in the highest
But
place.
you would put it that way.
No.
You just said it. Now you're taking it back.
There's
now?
still a hierarchy.
Okay, there's a hierarchy,
he's
but
fishing for a gotcha.
There's something at the top.
All right, you can worship things
Mary
below.
is quite a ways up the hierarchy, but not at the top.
Let's go over your definition of worship again. What's your definition of worship?
Attend to.
Attend to.
Prioritize.
Do Catholics
sacrifice for.
What do Catholics attend to? Do they prioritize Mary over all other human beings?
No, I didn't say overall, did I? I didn't add that to my definition.
You understand.
I said there was a hierarchy as well.
You attend to
So you can attend to something trivially, or you can attend to it deeply.
Okay, now you're adding stuff to the definition. But your original definition...
I added the hierarchy part at the beginning.
Are you
just
familiar?
didn't understand it.
Are you familiar with the Immaculate Conception?
Why is that relevant?
Because you go to a Catholic church, don't you? Or you've attended recently. You're interested in Catholicism, aren't you?
Sure.
All right. Are you familiar with their doctrines?
Somewhat.
Okay. You're
Their
familiar.
doctrines are very
How do they
deep.
regard Mary?
Why are you asking me that?
Because you're a Christian.
You say that. I haven't claimed that.
What the heck?
What is this? Is this Christians versus atheists?
I don't know.
You don't know where you are right now.
Don't be a smartass.
Well,
and I mean
either
it,
you're a
'cause
Christian
I won't
or you're
talk
not.
to you if you're a smartass.
Oh, either you're a Christian or you're not. Which one is it?
I could be either of them, but I don't have to tell you.
You don't have to tell me. I was under the impression
private.
I was invited to talk to a Christian. Am I not talking to a Christian?
No, you were invited to.
I think everyone should look at the title of the YouTube channel. You're probably in the wrong YouTube video.
You're really quite something, you are.
Aren't I? But you're really quite nothing. Right? You're not a Christian.
Okay, I'm done with him.
I bet that dude really feels like he did something.
Hi there.
Hi, nice
What's
to meet
your
you.
name?
Gerard.
Hello, Gerard.
Nice to meet you, sir. So you've said that worship is when you prioritize and sacrifice for something, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But there's a hierarchy in there.
Sure. So I prioritize and sacrifice for my wife more than I would prioritize and sacrifice for a random person on the street, right?
Probably, yeah.
Presumably. Do I worship
I don't know.
my
I've
wife?
seen some pretty bad marriages.
Assuming a good marriage, are you saying I worship my wife?
I'm trying to define worship.
Well, that's what I'm asking. So prioritize and sacrifice. I do
the
those
higher
things.
it is in the hierarchy, the more what you're doing is akin to worship. But even in your trivial acts of attention, you're prioritizing and partaking in worship, even if you don't know it.
So I am
And it's
prioritizing.
partly, well, with regard to your wife, say. So why do you value your wife? You do value your
Yes,
wife.
I love
okay.
her. So I
Right.
prioritize and I
Okay.
sacrifice for her.
Right. So that's within the confines of love, let's say. And
Sure.
what else does it serve?
What else does what serve?
Your love in your marriage?
I mean, I am married to my wife because I love her. That's
Yeah.
also why I prioritize and sacrifice for her. I certainly wouldn't think I worship her, and I don't think anyone else would make that.
I'm
Are you
trying to
making
make
that
a
claim?
definition.
Okay.
Yeah, that there's a hierarchy of attentional priority, and as you move up it, or down it, depending on whether you think about it as a pinnacle or a foundation, you move more towards worship. Right,
Okay.
so even the small things, I'll give you an example. Imagine you go on a date. Well, imagine that your aim is a long-term relationship like a marriage. Okay, now imagine that your aim is short-term sexual gratification. Your pattern of attention is going to vary during the date, depend on your ultimate end. That's the hierarchy. The way that you attend to your wife is dependent on your ultimate aims, even if you don't know it.
So at what point is it worship? Because it sounds like you're saying
It's
worship is almost a
shades.
spectrum, right? Or it's not a binary. It's not a.
It's kind of
quantum.
like, that's a good
So
question.
when
It's
is when is it worship? As
That was actually what I was about to say. It sounds like he's saying like once you reach, well, I would think that once you reach the pinnacle of that, that is what you worship. That's actually the similar to the argument that I make. Like everybody does worship something because everybody has something that they prioritize above all else. And that is, I would say it was worship. Well, I am a fan, but I wouldn't call it a fan stream. I'm just watching it. It's a Christian stream, and I noticed that he was debating atheists, so yeah.
As opposed to just I love my wife.
Oh, and I agree that this is that he could use a distinction between worship and veneration.
the closer you
But I would say he would say that veneration is like close to worship, which it kind of is. But yeah.
you get to the top or the bottom, the more it's more like
How close
worship.
to the top? Because I don't think I worship anything. And if you're saying I have to hit a certain
Oh, you're not
threshold,
Christian at all, but I like JBP. Hey, well, I mean, let Jordan Peterson tell it he's not Christian either. So, hey.
for it to be worship, it is possible I don't worship anything then, right?
It's not possible that you don't worship anything.
What do I worship?
Because you wouldn't attend. Well, love.
So you think I
apparently.
worship love?
Do you attend in consequence of love? See, I'm trying to define something. What do you mean worship? I told you what I meant. What do you mean?
So I mean, something you worship is something that you have a reverential view for in a manner in which you believe it to be above and beyond normal things you like. Like you
So do you
presumably
have
worship
that attitude towards your wife?
I have that
Do you
attitude.
privilege her compared to other women?
Of course I privilege her compared to
Okay.
other women, but I don't worship her. Nor does she worship me.
By the definition you just offered, yes, you do. Because you just offered a definition that involved prioritization and elevation.
Well, and thinking that she is divine above and beyond what a normal natural phenomenon can be. Not other women, no, beyond any human being could ever be. I will prioritize her over any
you're
other
making
human, but I
the
don't
assumption.
think that she is some
You're making
supernatural
the
being.
assumption that only the thing at the top or the bottom has anything to do with worship. And I'm saying that's not true. It's a hierarchy of prioritization. And there's either something at the top or the bottom, depending on the metaphor, or
I would say that is true. I don't agree with him there. I think it is the thing at the top. I think the problem with this atheist guy is he's saying that the thing at the top has to be divine, and it doesn't. I would say that a lot of people worship themselves because they prioritize themselves over and above everything else. I think that's really all there is to it.
fragmented and confused. Those are the only options.
So let's say
you're
I'm
either going in many directions,
Okay.
or you're going in one direction.
So let's suppose I'm fragmented and confused. Then you
Yeah.
agree I don't worship anything.
No, then you'd worship multiple things.
So what's the threshold when it's worship, right? I prioritize a lot of stuff.
I said.
Yeah, that's basically what
the closer
idolatry
you get
is.
to the pinnacle, or the
How
closer
close?
you get.
Can you
And this is also why, if you're like reading especially the first chapter of Romans, Paul actually basically encompasses all sin, period, into idolatry.
give me some sort of metric? How close do I got to get to this pinnacle?
Do you know the difference between cheap literature and deep literature?
Yes.
Okay, that's the same issue. And how do you distinguish between them? What's the difference between cheap and deep?
I mean, it's really an opinion-based thing, right?
Is
I mean,
it? So it's just an opinion that
plenty of-
Dostoevsky is better than a porno magazine.
Well, I've spoken to people who think To Kill a Mockingbird's cheap. It's one of my favorite books. So, I mean, people will differ on
Well,
opinions.
just because people are stupid about things doesn't mean that their opinion is valid.
That's certainly
Do
true.
you, well,
I do
let
agree
me
with
ask
it.
you.
I agree with that.
Okay, well, do you think there is a hierarchy in literary quality?
I think that there is a hierarchy to an extent in literary quality, but I think once you get to a certain threshold, it is just opinion. Like, I agree. Dostoevsky
Okay.
is better than a porno mag, but is F. Scott Fitzgerald
Why do
better
you
than
think
Ernest
that?
Hemingway? I don't know.
Yeah, fair enough. Why do you think that?
Because of what a book is, what literature is. Dostoevsky, he follows what literature is the purpose of more than the porno magazine
Okay,
does.
good. Well,
So it's about purpose
so
and
let me,
definitions.
yeah, sure. Let me give you an analog then.
Okay.
The depth of worship is analogous to depth of literary significance. And the closer you get to what's deep, the more religious and worshipful your practice.
So to
and
use
maybe you
your
don't know what's at the bottom, but something needs to be, or you're confused.
Well, so to use your analogy then, how deep do I have to go for it to be worship? Do I have to be Catcher in the Rye? Do I have to be War and Peace? Or
Depends on what,
is
it depends on
Twilight
what you're
enough?
seeking for.
I'm seeking to know whether I worship something. You've claimed I worship something, and I
Well, if
want
you
to
want
know.
to have a deep and meaningful life, then you have to go all the way to the bottom or the top, and insofar as you're capable of doing that, because otherwise you'll be fragmented and miserable and anxiety-ridden and hopeless.
So I have to worship something to have a meaningful life. And if I
There's
worship
no
multiple-
difference between those two things.
Okay.
They're the same thing.
So if I don't worship anything, my life will not be meaningful, correct?
Well, that's the definition of nihilism.
Okay. So if I'm a nihilist, I don't worship anything.
That's true, and then you...
Oh, okay. You just said everybody worships something. I think you've just agreed there is a class of people that doesn't.
Well, there is...
I mean, he got him, but again, that's just a gotcha. People want a very... Okay, it's not possible. I mean, yeah, I agree. I think that right here you got him there, but I always say this is an issue I have with a lot of these gotchas. Your argument is not good if it can be defeated by simply rewording the statement. He said everybody worships something. So again, he found an example of where it doesn't include every single person on earth. Like if somebody is a nihilist, like truly a nihilist, which I think Jordan Peterson would argue that there are no real nihilists because you can't live as if life is meaningless. He might even say that. I've never seen this before. But even then, okay, you found the exception that proves the rule. That doesn't really change anything except maybe the way I worded it.
Incoherent in their worship, and hand gestures like that aren't going to help.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Look,
They're
if you're incoherent and fragmented and aimless, which is what happens if your objects of worship are unstructured and chaotic, then you're going to be anxiety-ridden and without hope. That happens. That's a technical argument.
But there's happy nihilists.
Oh,
How do you explain that there are happy nihilists then? Because
well,
you just said they
the
can't
mere
be.
fact that you state that there are happy nihilists doesn't make it true. Like, what's your evidence that? How do you measure nihilism, and how have you associated it with happiness? And what's your definition of happiness? And have you compared them to religious people? Because if you do, by the way, it's clearly the case that religious people, over the long run, have better mental health. It's a well-documented fact in psychological literature.
Sure.
So your claim is just a claim. It doesn't stand on anything.
So you disagree with the claim that there exists even one happy nihilist?
I didn't say that.
Okay, would you agree there exists at least one happy nihilist in the universe?
It's not a question that has any meaning as far as I'm concerned, because it
Okay.
depends on what you mean by happy, and it depends on the duration that you're trying to calculate over. Now and then there's probably some deluded soul who thinks he's a nihilist who's momentarily pleased with himself. But as a long-term strategy to deal with the future, to get along with yourself and with others, it's sadly lacking. That's why Nietzsche warned that when God died, as he announced in 1850, that people would be flooded with pointless, anxiety-ridden, hopeless nihilism. And that was what would attract them for example, to the false gods of totalitarianism, which is exactly what happened, because everybody worships something, even atheists who think they don't.
Aren't there unhappy Christians or
course
devoted
there are.
believers? So worshiping something is neither sufficient nor necessary for happiness then?
Well, terrible things can come your way regardless, and that does happen, but it's the case that even when circumstances become deeply troublesome, that how you're oriented makes a big difference. So I'll give you an example. So the book of Job deals with the issue of unfair suffering. So Job is a good man who has everything taken away from him in the most painful possible way.
To settle a bet, right?
With Satan, yes. And so he...
I always say this when people bring up Job to me. I don't know if it's the case with these guys because they seem pretty, some of them seem pretty smart, maybe even well-versed. But they talk to me about Job and how Job is this, Job is that. I was like, man, they really hate Job, but they don't understand Job. But if they understood Job, they would hate it way more than they do, because it goes against pretty much everything that they would think would be fair and good.
Makes the axiomatic presumption that he won't lose faith in
I think most
himself or
Christians
in
don't
the
understand
spirit
Job either,
of being
though.
itself. And that helps him remain calm and forward-looking through his time of trial.
Doesn't he absolutely curse God?
No, his wife tells him to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, good.
His wife
My
tells him
final
to
claim
curse
is
God
that
and
atheists
die.
accept Christian morality, but deny the religion's foundational stories. Hi there.
It's very nice to meet you.
What's
I'm
your
Ian.
name?
Oh, I
I'm
thought
Ian.
that was the
Hi,
douche
Ian.
Yes.
kid again.
So God says that you can own people as property. He says that you
Ah,
can beat them with
knew
a rod
it.
too. He commands genocide in Deuteronomy, in Numbers, and in Samuel. I mean, they have a goddamn baby barbecue in Numbers. Like, is all of this in line with Christian ethics?
No.
Yeah, I could dive
So then
into
God
Job
doesn't
in a
fit within
separate
Christian
video.
ethics.
That would be an
Well,
interesting thing
the
to
biblical library is a continuing story, and everything written in it has to be contextualized by the entire text. There's 65,000 hyperlinks in the biblical text. And you can take pieces of it out of context and criticize them, and that's what you're doing. But that's a mistake.
Oh, I don't know if I've
think
seen
it's
it. I gotta
an
look it
analytic mistake because you're putting the cart before the horse.
I really don't think so. I think
Yeah, I
that
know
if we say that something is Christian ethics, then I think that all of the books essential to Christianity would fit with it, especially.
Okay. I might get in trouble with my Protestant brothers and sisters here, but I think a lot of times when it comes to quote unquote Christian ethics, it's good to look at the church too, not just what we want to extract from the Bible, because of how these things were applied. Like he talks about genocide. Okay, just because God directed the Israelites to drive out the Canaanites, does that mean God approves of us committing genocide? Obviously not. But I mean, we could go
If
into
it's like
that
the
for
main
freaking
character,
hours.
when we're talking
How
about
do you deal with
God,
the morality of war?
So-
how do you think you should deal with the morality of war?
Sure. Because I feel like the morality, like I feel like Christian ethics, like this is kind of, I guess I just think it's like kind of an absurdity to say that God doesn't fit within Christian ethics. But sure, well, we can go on my ethics. That's totally fine.
I don't know what you mean by an absurdity. What game are you playing with
Well,
that
I just think
question?
that it's an absurdity to say that the Christian God doesn't fit within Christian ethics. That like the Christian
I
God
didn't
isn't
say
like
that.
Christian
I
ethical.
said that the specific statements that you made don't take the context of the stories into account, and so that your analytical approach is faulty.
Sure.
Don't put words in my mouth.
Sure, then let's go through
Thank
the
you.
example. Yeah, so, and I apologize. So let's go through the example. So in 1 Samuel 15:3, God says, go and slaughter the...
God is a man of war. I want to check that one out too. I actually been looking for a new book to read lately, so I might look at that one. There was one that people talked about. God, is God a moral monster? That people like really liked. I read it and I didn't think much of it, to be honest. I don't like how a lot of the apologetics books tackle slavery at all. I think a lot of those arguments are really bad.
The
But
Amalekites
I know this
slaughter
is
the
talking
men, the
about the
women,
whole
the children,
genocide
the
thing.
infants. What's the justification for that? Is that in line
That's a
with
good
Christian
question.
ethics?
That's a good question. I don't really know what to do with the terrible, blood-soaked, saturated history of the human past. I don't know. And I don't think anybody knows. I mean, what you try to do in your own life, as far as I can tell, is to conduct yourself in a manner that makes such things much more unlikely.
I totally agree.
We're all saddled with the problem of the catastrophes that got us here, aren't we?
Yeah, but this
and-
one was commanded by God. That's the problem.
Yeah,
That's
well-
what differentiates it from anything else, is that this one, it's God
Do you
saying,
think that
go
there's
and do
ever
this
such a thing?
atrocity.
Do you think that there's ever such a thing as a righteous war?
I'm skeptical. I'm not sure. It would probably be situational.
Well, right.
If it's
Fair enough.
situational, then there is a
Certainly
such
wasn't a
thing.
just war. The context for the Amalekite slaughter is that 400 years earlier, they fought one battle, which they lost, and God says, that's it, I'm going to wipe them off the face of the goddamn earth. And then 400 years later, he commands the Israelites to genocide their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. That's not a just war at all. And also, a genocide is not a war.
Well, a genocide can be a war, but...
Absolutely not.
Look.
The genociding of the Amalekites, the men, the women, and the infants, that's not a war. The infants aren't combatants.
Look, I already said that it's very difficult to look at the blood-soaked past and to know exactly what to do about it. The answer I gave to the gentleman who is sitting here before you is that it's necessary to read a text like the Bible at all of its levels of analysis simultaneously. And there's a directional morality that emerges across time that has its roots in the Old Testament, for example, with its restrictions against murder specifically, that makes itself manifest in the Christian texts as the insistence on voluntary self-sacrifice as the foundational belief. That's a profoundly anti-violence ethos.
Do you have the belief in your theology?
Well, what do you think?
That he's not equipped to address this biblical issue. I think so too. I think this is part of where his not being I don't even think it's a matter of not being a biblical scholar, because you don't have to be a biblical scholar to address these things. But I think it's one of the weaknesses of him not being overtly Christian is that he has issues with basically accepting the authority of God because of his definition of God is so like lucid, for lack of a better term.
Think of that. Wait a sec. Now redress what I just said.
So I'm about to address it, but I'm addressing it with a question. Do you think that God is by his very essence perfect?
You'll have to provide more.
Sure, just like maximally great in all like the great making qualities.
Sure.
Yeah, like flawless. Yeah. So does a flawless thing change? Does a flawless thing reveal like more and better information over time, or would a flawless thing say, here's what's good, here is the absolute good thing to do at all?
A flawed person cannot say what a flawless being would do. This is another problem I have with a lot of these atheist arguments when they say, if I was God, I would do this. If you were God, you would be omniscient, and you have no idea what you would do if you were omniscient because you're not freaking omniscient.
All circumstances in time.
Well, we know some of that.
Wait,
Tell
so
the truth. That's one.
That's totally fine, but presumably...
No. You don't get to skate over that. That's totally fine.
It's a straw man of my position. It's a straw man of the argument. So
In what way?
Argument is that God...
Wait a sec. You said find one maxim that's transcendent across situations.
I didn't say any of those words. I'm not sure what conversation you're a part of.
Don't be a smartass.
I'm sorry.
Seriously. I mean it. If we're going to have a serious conversation, conduct yourself properly. Okay. Rephrase your question so that, because I must have missed it. I tried to answer it.
So in my mind, I guess by my lights, a perfect being doesn't change. A perfect being, if they're maximally good, maximally moral.
Does our understanding of the perfect being change?
Our understanding might, but presumably what the perfect being is revealing.
Well, I agree. How do we distinguish between that, though, at the human level?
How do we distinguish between whether...
Between our transforming understanding of perfection and perfection itself.
But between our...
We can only see through our own lenses.
Presumably a perfect being would be revealing all of these aspects all the time, especially if God's outside of time. I don't know how a God who's outside of time is revealing different things at different times. That just seems like incoherent to me.
Imagine something that's perfect.
Sure.
And complete.
Sure.
Okay, and it's trying to communicate with creatures who are anything but that.
Sure.
Well, they're going to get it wrong.
Sure.
Okay, now wait a sec. Do you blame that on the interpreters or the phenomena itself? For example, are you perfect in attending to your conscience?
Hold on. At the point in time when God is literally the one who created us, he could have created us in a way where we would always be receptive to these principles, where we don't have to go across like a learning curve where, maybe we'll understand like thousands of years into the future, maybe we'll do it. Oh, also, if you believe in an all-knowing God, then free will is impossible because you threw free will into the mix.
I hate the doggone free will thing. That if you believe that because God knows what you are going to do, then you can't freely do it. Because free will, and I'm just going to say it and keep playing the video. Knowledge does not have any causal link to somebody's actions. Knowing someone will do something cannot cause them to do it. Foreknowledge has absolutely nothing to do with free will. I don't think I needed to say that, but I needed to say that.
Well, that was the answer to your question.
Yeah, and
you said, why wouldn't God Well, you know,
It's
a thousand
contradictory.
years of deep-thinking philosophers would disagree with you.
Yeah,
But have it
and
your
a
way.
thousand years of, or at least like the last 50 years of philosophers would disagree with you. These analytic philosophers, people like Graham Oppie make arguments about the incompatibility of omniscience and free will, that if God created this world, if he chose this world instead of that world, then he makes it causally inevitable every single action that you were going to make. If he made a world where we were just electrons in love, then none of this would have happened. But by making us in this world, knowing exactly what's going to happen in the future, it makes all of those events inevitable, which means that they're all causally determined, which means that we have no free will if you believe in an all-good God, or an all-knowing God that made everything.
Well, have it your way.
Okay, cool. So then the free will theodicy fails.
Well, it fails for you. That doesn't mean you've disproved it. I mean,
Do you want to
tried
respond
to
to
make
the argument?
Yes, you tried to make a case for a causally deterministic universe. I don't think there's any evidence for that at all.
Do you think that God could have created a different universe than the one that he created?
I have no idea.
Okay, so then there's going to be a double bind, right? So either he couldn't have.
For one, the idea that God could have done something doesn't make any sense for an eternal being. Everything that God does is within his nature. To say that God could have done something is to say that God could be different, which means that God would not be immutable. But anyway, at least that's just off the top of my head. But yes, I agree with you. That's like Adam blaming the creator. Always blaming the creator. If God hadn't done this, and this is what they always do, God knows what would make me believe in him. And I tell people this all the time. It is not God's job to make it impossible for you to sin. It's just not. It's like you can choose to do it. It's not God's job to make it impossible for you to sin.
Have done it, in which case he lacks a power, or he could have done it, in which case we don't have free will, because he chose this world instead of that world, making the events of this world instead of that world inevitable with his infallible knowledge.
I don't understand where you're headed.
It just means that the free will defense fails. Like all this, under
Like
your
I said,
view,
if
under
you want
your
to
view,
have it
free
fail,
will.
no problem. I don't know why it's relevant to the issue we're
Do you
discussing.
acknowledge that under your view, free will doesn't exist?
No.
Oh, then do you want to respond to the argument?
You'll have to phrase it more
Sure.
clearly
The argument
so that someone like me can understand it.
Yeah, gotcha. So God already knows in advance everything that's going to happen, which means that by making this world instead of that world, everything is inevitable, which means that God's act of causing this world instead of that
Inevitable
world.
doesn't mean determined.
It's causally inevitable if God chooses this world instead of that world.
Doesn't make it determined.
Causally inevitable means determined.
No, it doesn't.
Absolutely, yes, it does.
Well, have it your way.
Okay.
That's not the case.
You've been voted out by the majority. Please return to your seat.
You just wish they were nicer. To be honest, I wish they were nicer too. But I like the conversation between him and Cosmic Skeptic. I watched the one of these with Cosmic Skeptic and when he was surrounded by Christians, and there were some Christians on there that I knew who I was very disappointed in, especially with his thing that Jesus never claimed to be God, because most of the Christians on there, I think only one of them actually addressed his claim. The other ones were, it wasn't that good. But yeah, it would be cool if they were nicer to each other. But unfortunately, there are so many atheists who think
I'm
being
Liam.
smug
Hi, Liam.
has
How you
to
doing?
come with
I'm
the
doing well. How are
territory.
you?
Not
And
too
I
bad.
don't know why.
Good. Surrounded by atheists.
My question to you, let me scoot in, would be.
Although I will acknowledge that a lot of that can come from how they get treated by Christians.
What does it mean to accept Christian values precisely, or Christian morality?
It means to aim up as hard as you can, no matter what happens to you.
Okay.
Okay.
That's like the vaguest thing he has ever said.
I think that that's a very broad definition of what Christian
Yeah, but
morality
it'll come
is.
in handy at some point in your life.
Right, but I think that many different disciplines and theologies.
Well, you asked for a truncated answer. Eh? I
Right.
mean, there's other ways of representing the
Yeah.
situation, but I wanted to give you something that was kind of foundational briefly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It doesn't mean it's, exhaustive.
Yeah.
I could say that you would have to believe that Christ is God and he died for your sins,
Mhm.
right? But that's in a very difficult way to understand. That's the same claim.
Yeah. If there are other theologies and disciplines that have similar types of values, How then is that definition mean? Like, wouldn't those also be Christian values under your definition?
That's a good question. I spent a lot of time studying different religious systems from all over the world and found multiple interesting layers of concordance.
Right.
So, for example, in ancient Egypt, their god Horus, who was the reviving god of the totalitarian state, the corrupt he was the god of attention. Right, and the Jews hypothetically came out of Egypt, and there was crosstalk between Egyptian and Jewish foundational morality, and then that bled into Christianity. I mean, human beings all over the world have come up with moral systems that fit roughly into a pattern, and they're very usefully studied. You know, I learned a lot about Christianity by studying Taoism, for example, like a lot. So I think you can make a case that Christianity formalized the landscape of good and evil more comprehensively and in more detail than any other religious system. And I think that that's part of the reason that it defeated paganism and spread so broadly across the West and is still dominant, still understructures our culture, for example.
The way you feel about Horus or Taoism or something is how I feel about Christian morals, I think.
Yeah, but how do I feel about them?
Well, that you took inspiration from them, you learned from them. Maybe
That's a good start, you know, because I would say that actually constitutes belief. You know, like you said, well, look.
Right.
In Noah, in the story of Noah, right? Noah is inspired by the apprehension that all hell is going to break loose, okay?
Yeah.
He regards that inspiration as God.
Okay.
Right, and when God comes to Abraham, he comes to Abraham as the spirit of adventure. It's inspiration. One of the definitions of God in the Old Testament, unsurprising.
See, that's stuff like that is where he loses me. When he starts talking about the biblical stories, and I feel like he over allegorizes them, like him coming to Abraham as the spirit of adventure. And I was like, no, he just said, Abraham, get the F out of here. I mean, I feel like it doesn't go deeper than that. And maybe that's just me being an idiot.
The derivation of the word is inspiration. And so if you take inspiration from Christian ideas, then insofar as you do that, you are in fact a believer, which was my point with regards to atheists not understanding.
But have
what
you
they're
taken
rejecting.
inspiration from Taoism or from studying Egyptian mythology?
Definitely.
So then you believe them?
You can believe in those things.
Yeah, but I've incorporated them
a
into something
sense.
I think that's more comprehensive.
Is it possible to take inspiration and to appreciate the teachings without being a believer in their truth claims?
It depends. No, I don't think so. But I think, you see, there are different kinds of truth claims, right? There's propositional truth claims, which are the truth claims of what you say. And then there's embodied truth claims, which is the truth claims of what you do. That should be prioritized. Optimally, what you say and what you do would be brought into harmony. But I would say if you had to prioritize, it should be what you attend to and what you act first. And that's what Christ actually says in the Gospels, because he points to the Pharisees, for example, who say all the right things, but don't do any of the right things, and points out very clearly that that's not acceptable.
I don't know that the Christian morality, those principles originate in Christianity, because you brought up other things that predate Christianity that you can very closely tie Christianity to.
Well, I don't think they do originate precisely. I mean, I don't think the Christian claim is exactly that they originate Christianity.
So if I'm living those values, how is it that I'm living the Christian values and maybe not the Egyptian values or something else?
Well,
that you
one
brought
of
up?
There, you've been voted out by
that was good. That was good. Yeah.
That was good. I did most of the talking. I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem with allegorical readings. I read a few stories in the Bible as like I think a lot of them can go either way, and I think a lot of them should go either way. I think it gets to a point of allegory where it's like you said, like supplanting the plain meaning. Like I think saying that God comes to Abraham as the spirit of adventure, it comes dangerously close to just taking God out of the story and just making it something in Abraham's head. I think that's the issue I have with it.
Hi.
Hello there. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. What's your name?
I'm Kumari. So I was curious about this like Christian morality that you're
kite.
talking about, because a lot of my issues with Christianity have to do with the base morality of it, specifically with like the idea of like the rapture and how we see people that aren't going to come up with us with the rapture, and that concept of heaven and hell. I don't really agree with that morality, but if you could explain that to me and how I do agree with that, I would love to like hear.
Well,
your
I
opinions.
can't explain the rapture to you because that isn't something I concern myself with, and that's more of a
That's true.
sectarian belief than something that's central to Christianity. Now, there's all sorts of events.
Yeah, I don't talk about eschatology on social media, so I'm not gonna give my thoughts on the rapture. But yeah, if that's what's holding you back, I would tell her if that's part of what's holding you back from Christianity, you don't have to believe in the rapture.
Evangelical Protestants who might disagree with that, but
Yeah.
that doesn't have anything to do with me. You asked a deeper question with regard to, let's say, heaven and hell and judgment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a tough one, right? I mean, sin, you could put it this way, sin is what puts you in hell, right? And so then you might ask, well, how do you know you're in hell? How about you do anything to get out of it?
Can I ask you
How
a
about
question?
you know that you put yourself there?
Do you think is sin like a part of Christian morality?
What
to
do you mean exactly? Sin as
Like
a part.
the
It's missing
concept
the
of sin?
Okay,
Yeah.
it's derived from an archery term, and it means to miss the target, right? And so it presumes that there's such a thing as a central target, and that you can miss it in many ways. And the consequence of that will be your life will be ridden with anxiety. Your life will be pointless.
And what
People
if
will
I,
turn
like,
against
don't
you.
believe in sin at all?
Well, do you believe in error?
I
Have you made
don't-
any mistakes?
What if I believe that the mistakes that you make, that they're fixable, and so that no sin is finite, and that the
Well,
idea
that's a Christian belief.
of the idea of hell, I don't believe
No, that's
in
also
it
a
because
Christian belief, by the way.
A Christian belief is hell?
No, that there's no sin that, well, there's one. The sin against the Holy Ghost is unforgivable, but that's really the sin against the process that would enable you to learn.
Okay. But there's a Christian belief that hell does exist, and if I commit sin, I'm going to go there, correct?
Yes.
So what if I don't? I don't believe in that.
repent.
Like I think
Well, okay, let me
that
a-
when you
okay,
can I
that's
explain
good.
a little bit?
Sure, sure.
Okay. Thank you. I think that when you commit sin, that it's because of a lot of environmental factors in your life, like where you were born and who you were raised by, and so there are certain things that lead you down a dangerous path. And once you are dead, I think you're kind of removed of that person. There's no like.
I can't
There are no
say any-
factors
I can't
of the
say
earth
anything
that have
about
to.
what happens after death.
Right.
So I would ask you, in these times that you've suffered terribly in ways that you thought would
So
never
you're
end, do
thinking
you
of
believe
hell
that
as
you had
something
any
like
causal
on
role
earth?
in that? Like, did you play a part in that?
In my own suffering?
Yeah.
Maybe sometimes I would say
Okay.
that there was a part that I played
well,
in
that's-
that.
okay,
but I
that's
also
the thing
do
to
think
find
that,
out.
I think that
It
maybe
looks
it's like
like
a
her
concept of free
glasses
will
are,
that I
like,
don't really
pinching
believe
the heck
in somewhat
out
of
of
free
her nose.
will,
It
but I
looks
think that
super
there are certain things in your
uncomfortable, but maybe
life
that's
that
just how her
lead you
nose is
to
shaped.
do certain behaviors. And so when you commit those sins, you go to hell. I'm not too sure why you would still be reaping the consequences
do you
of that.
like I said, I can't
Yeah.
address that. Do you believe that you can change?
I do.
Do you believe you can change for the better?
I do.
Do you believe that when you change for the better, you abandon the things you've done in the past that weren't good?
I think that you can.
Okay, then
Yeah.
that's very much in keeping with Christian doctrine.
Can you explain to me how that's in keeping with Christian
Well,
doctrine?
you believe
if you would go to hell for
okay,
those things?
You believe you can improve,
Yeah.
right? And you believe that if you improved, you would
Yeah,
let
like
go
you
of
just
things
sin
that were
and you just
impeding you. That's a
immediately
sacrifice.
fall into
you
a
believe
pit
that
in the floor and
improvement
go to
would be
hell.
upward, and you believe that you have agency in that. Yeah, those are all Christian presuppositions.
I guess maybe we have different opinions of what Christian morality is.
Yes, sounds
so
like
I think
it.
that my opinion of Christian morality is something that I don't really agree with, and maybe you would define that as like the foundations
Well,
of Christianity.
let me give you an example. So,
Judging by her, what she says about the rapture and her view of Christian morality, it sounds like her view of Christian morality is legalistic. Like, you do these things, you go to hell. That's what it sounds like.
So if you
It's
want
like,
to
yeah,
atone,
it's like repentance.
which
It
means to
seems like repentance isn't even
unify
coming to
yourself
mind.
and unify that with the world.
And it's like literally what, I don't know why he won't just use the darn word, but literally what he's describing, like turning away from those things and aiming upward, is repentance. I don't know why he won't just say it's she believes in repentance, but it's saying if I do these things, I'm going to go to hell.
Then the first thing you have to do is figure out what you did wrong and admit it. That's a confession. That was good.
Thank you. It was nice.
Yeah, nice to meet you too.
Oh, home stretch. Okay, we've been at this for
I
a
picked
while.
Xena because I think she asked genuine questions and wasn't
I
trying
liked
to
her.
win.
Hey, well, hello again.
Hi there.
My claim
shade.
is Jordan
No, I
Peterson's
liked her.
framework for understanding Christianity is probably not the one that the Bible intended us to use. In regards to the way that you
I think
interpret
she's
the
right,
Bible,
but I
I
don't think it
don't
matters.
see. You have said in some circumstances that there's not a way to kind of say whether or not ontologically the historical claims made by the Bible are true. Like, for example, the story of Cain and Abel. You've said that this story is like a meta-truth in the sense that it exists all throughout time, culturally. And the way that you define meta-truth, I don't see a distinction between that and like a metaphor, right? But and you also said that you cannot say whether this story was true. You can say that it exists eternally, metaphorically, but you can't say that it's true. And if you can't say that there are historical facts being said in the Bible as stories that weren't really said with much ambiguity, how can we say that we can understand the Bible in the way that it's meant to be interpreted? Like, if you cannot make any claims about these stories, right? You don't know whether they're true or false. How do you know that your interpretation is the correct way?
So that's why I picked you. You ask intelligent questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was good. What do they say? By their fruits you'll know them.
Okay.
Right.
I'm telling you,
well,
she's right
so
there.
one of the things I
She's
look
like
at
right
is the impact
there.
of what I'm doing. Right. And so I know a lot of evangelical Christians, a lot of Catholics, a lot of Orthodox Christians, a lot of people from other faiths. And they've told me, like many of them, that they found my interpretations very helpful and that it deepened their faith. And so that's interesting because I wouldn't have necessarily expected that to be the case. And I've also talked to thousands of people who've told me that they came to understand the foundational stories of their culture better as a consequence of listening to me, and that they did everything they could to sort out their lives and that it worked. That's many different pieces of evidence that all converge on something like the practical and conceptual utility of my approach. Now, is it the same? There is a lot of approaches to biblical interpretation historically, and what I'm doing is possibly less new than you think.
Yeah, I want to make a claim on whether
They can be helpful, but can't be the fundamental frame for a Christian. I agree. I think the way that, and I would say that his things helped me a little bit. Like some of the, especially like I watched his original lectures on some of the Old Testament books, and I thought they were really, really interesting. I don't agree with everything he says, and I don't always agree with his approach, but I think they're insightful, and I think at the very least, they can help you think of these things in a different way. Even if you don't agree with the way that he interprets it, just sort of like changing the way you think of it can help. And this is why I'm not totally against allegorizing the Bible, because if you look at the New Testament, a lot of what they do in the New Testament with the Old Testament is similar. Like how they use, I'm thinking about Paul, how he used Abraham as an example of, or rather, not Abraham, he used, doggone it, I can't remember what I was going to say. I lost my train of thought. But basically, they take those Old Testament stories and they apply them to the current situation they're talking about. When he was saying that, that's what it was. When he was saying that Isaac was the promised son, even though he was the youngest son, so he got the inheritance, and he compared that to Israel. So he was even seeing that Hagar and Sarah, that's what it was. That's what I was talking about. I couldn't get it off the top of my head. But he did that, and he did the same thing with Isaac being the promised son. We are talking about the exact same thing. I'm just talking about the sons, and those are the wives. But yeah, how he compared Isaac being the promised son. So he said that we are the children of promise, not necessarily by inheritance. And it shows that, just because you are the children of Israel by blood doesn't mean you're necessarily the children of the promise. So he was using it. I found that very sort of a, what's that word that one guy used? Petersonian way of looking at it. I think it's a lot more straightforward than what Jordan Peterson does. But that's why I don't really have too much of a problem with his approach. I do agree that it's definitely not something you can lay a foundation on. I think that's something for very, very mature Christians to do. I think if you come into Christianity, it's just going to make everything feel muddy for you. But I think if you're mature, that it can help because you have
enough,
more of a
right, to
foundation.
substantiate whether or not your interpretation is going to, be more plausible, right? Be the most plausible. Because in regards,
it's an open question.
Yeah, right.
You bet.
So, in regards to how we interpret the Bible and how we see the Bible, something can add value to someone's life. An interpretation can add value to someone's life. An interpretation can connect you to your conception of what your faith is. But if it's the quote unquote interpretation that God does not intend, that can lead to a plethora.
That's certainly the case. That's why the medieval Christians were so concerned about heresy.
Exactly.
Yeah, because they felt, and that's why the Catholics objected so much to the Protestant Reformation, because they believed that the fractionation of Christianity would result in an indefinite fractionation, right? Well, and that's exactly.
They weren't wrong. And this is coming from a Protestant. They were not wrong.
What's happening.
Man.
Right.
So yeah, that's definitely a problem. I think one of the foundational principles, for example, there's a foundational principle in the Old Testament of hospitality. Mm-hmm. Right. So what you want to do if you set up your local environment properly is to make it welcoming to people voluntarily. And so one of the ways you could judge the validity of the interpretation of a classic story is whether or not that interpretation might be regarded by someone as welcoming. Does that represent something you'd actually like to have if you were acting in your own interest in the long run?
Right, and we can talk about that. Like
protect you from fear might be another one.
Exactly. So we can talk about how these interpretations of the Bible, if they kind of resonate with us. And I think that can in some case be some kind of evidence, this might be true, but I think we need to ask, is this evidence damning, right? Is this evidence certain, right? Yeah. So, but I do want to look at, again, the consequences and our understanding of this interpretation once more. So we look at, again, the story of Cain and Abel, and we say, yeah, so I believe this is a meta-truth. I believe that this story is resonant throughout cultures. That is all true and dandy, and I'm sure that there is in some way, the story was put in here for the reason, right? To tell us about, fights between brothers. Mm-hmm. But also, you can't say I do know or I don't know that this story is false or true in an ontological, historical sense, as a historical fact. Were there two people
I don't think it matters.
That were specifically referenced.
Okay, I don't think that's knowable, but I'm not sure why it matters to you.
So the reason why it matters to me is because we need to know how we should interpret the things that the Bible says, and the things
many ways.
Right, but if we interpret
sometimes poetry, sometimes history, sometimes fact,
but
sometimes
for example,
metaphor.
The reason why it's important, right, very important, is because, for example, we can talk about something like God says, I believe it's 1 Corinthians 15:17, something about how belief in God specifically as someone who resurrected or as someone who died for our sins is important, right? But we have to look at, if we can interpret that as just you have to believe that God is a symbol of sacrifice. That is different from believing that there was an actual person named Jesus Christ who died on the cross for our sins.
True.
So if you believe one and not the other, that can be the difference between you going to hell and you going to heaven. So if we cannot make, we cannot say that we know whether or not certain historical facts in the Bible happen, even as just events, because the events matter, because again, God dying for our sins on the cross was an event. If we can't say that we know these things happened, these things did or didn't happen, this then leads us to kind of the conundrum of how do we know what we are meant to believe, what the Bible intended for us to believe, and this can be very, very important to our fate. Do you see what I'm saying?
I've got no disagreement with any of that.
I think that is, I think partially that's where tradition comes into play. And I think it can be complicated. One of the things I like about Christianity and about the Bible is that it's, reality is messy, and it's as messy as reality can be. And what she said about believing, it's like Paul said, if Jesus isn't resurrected, we're still in our sins. I think stuff like that is pretty straightforward, especially because, Jesus was an actual historical person. Our faith is not based on Jesus as a symbol. Our faith is based on the bodily resurrection of Jesus. If he was raised, we can be raised. If he was raised metaphorically, then we'll be raised metaphorically, which means not at all. So I think that's the big difference. If there really was no Cain and Abel, then that really doesn't mean much. That story, it still resonates throughout history. It still has all of its meaning. If something like the resurrection is metaphorical, it loses its meaning, because the whole point is, it's like what Paul was saying in Acts, when he said, I'm talking about resurrection from the dead. So if Jesus being resurrected is the catalyst for our resurrected, he has to have physically, bodily resurrected, or then that doesn't mean anything or it might mean something, but again, it'll just be metaphorical, which when we're talking about eternal life doesn't really mean anything.
What sort of response do you want from that?
So
you pushed me beyond the limits of my knowledge.
Really?
Well,
I think
there's so many things you can't know. I'm struggling. I know that the biblical stories are the foundation of Western culture.
Mm-hmm.
I know that the consequence of those stories has been the genesis of a society that is in the main freer and more abundant than any societies have ever been. I don't exactly understand the relationship between those stories and that outcome, but it's not nothing.
Right.
But I don't know the answer to the questions that you're asking. You know,
Exactly.
it's the case that forever when
he's
people
not a
have been
Christian.
interpreting religious stories, they wrestled with exactly the question that you just described.
Mm-hmm.
When is it fact? When is it poetry? When is it music? When is it metaphor? When is it ritual? When is it time-bound?
But what I'm saying is that your interpretation of the Bible, if you cannot tell us, again, if these historical events happened or not, that can be deciding factor in if someone is like damned to hell for eternity or if they go to heaven, right? So that's why
That's why you don't get your theology from Jordan freaking Peterson.
You know, like that would be something that would stem more from an evangelical viewpoint. And I'm not putting that down, by the way. You're asking me a question I really can't answer.
Okay.
I'm not claiming even that my interpretations are canonically correct. I can only tell you the consequences of having released them into the world, let's say.
Right. So I guess we've kind of come to a conclusion about that, which I've kind of wrestled with your framework and pushed it kind of to its end, at least in the way that you can answer my question. So I don't know that we can more wrestle with that.
See, I guess the problem is, you see, I don't exactly understand.
Yeah, I think Jordan Peterson, if he's not already converted, I think he's pretty darn close, especially since his daughter converted. I think that was a big thing for him, especially with all that she's been through, and everything that they went through with his wife and with him almost dying from that drug addiction that he had. Yeah, I think all of that stuff is pushing him further and further and further. But I think that basically, and I kind of feel this. I feel this completely. I think that he is almost. Is she? Is his wife Catholic now? I know Michaela, I think, is Catholic. But it was something that C.S. Lewis said this in Miracles when he said that people search from God and then they pull back, supposing they'd actually found him because they never expected it to come to that. I think that might be, and of course I'm just speculating, but I think that might be where he is. That, like, you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, but once you reach the light at the end of the tunnel, then it's there. Then all of these things sort of get solidified, and you're not really playing in that intellectual sandbox anymore. At least not as much as you were before. But again, that's just me speculating. I'm not in this guy's head.
I don't think anybody does, the relationship between fact and destiny. You know, well, they're different realms in a way, because knowing what the world is made of doesn't help you navigate through it. Not really. It doesn't provide you with a foundation for navigation. But knowing the facts of the world is obviously useful. And the relationship between those two things, part of that's the mystery of Western civilization and the continued competition between science and religion.
To bridge this kind of understanding between fact and destiny is like an important question that the burden is on Christianity to answer, and specifically interpretations of Christianity. And if we can't do that,
why is the burden on Christianity?
Because it posits, right, that this interpretation, right, is going to be a way to understand God. But if it's faulty, right, that can
what evidence would you accept?
That would be an interesting question, because I've seen people try to answer the question, and I've never really been moved because I can always attack and then again kind of gets to this point where the answer is I don't know.
Well, here's
Okay,
an answer.
let's pause there. I'm sorry, that's time.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the right.
Well, I definitely picked the right person.
Thank you.
That was very good.
Thank you so
Really,
much.
Very good. I
Yeah, I
don't
liked her.
like talking to win.
I liked her.
But there were portions of all the conversations that were truly productive, and that it's instructive for people to see the distinction between a debate that's aimed
Literally
at
punching
local
the air.
victory and dominance, let's say, even of ideas, and a discussion that's predicated on mutual exploration.
I did
and
too.
establishment
That was a heck of a cliffhanger.
Like a harmonious
I wanted to hear
understanding
what he
and
was
peace.
going to say.
Jordan
'cause he was like,
Peterson,
"Here's
out
an
of all
answer."
of the kind of theists that are on the internet, he is one of the better ones in regards to just like
One of
being
the
genuine
better
as a person. But I do feel like he does a lot of, I guess, wordplay that can make it a little bit difficult and
Word
kind
salad.
of just muddies
He
the
does.
waters in regard to what we define as Christianity and atheism.
Jordan Peterson, I credit to turning me into an atheist. I had a blast talking to him today. I think if the average person followed what Jordan Peterson said, they'd realize that fundamentally Jordan Peterson is not a Christian, in fact, uses many atheistic principles, and operated under bad faith by seeming to forget what basic words meant when he didn't want to answer a question.
His definitions can kind
That
of
was
shift a little
salty.
bit depending on the
Oh, what I meant about the rapture not being an issue. What I meant about the rapture not being an issue is basically that you can. No, Jordan. I think Jordan. Okay, let me go. Let me address this real quick. Honestly, the word salad thing, I agree. The only thing about Jordan Peterson is with the word salad is that I don't think he does it on purpose. I think Jordan Peterson does the word salad because he's trying very, very hard to be hyper specific in what he says. Like when he says he's really careful with his language, he means it. But when he does that, he just comes off as confusing. There's a clip of him that's been going around where, so I think somebody asked him about being a Christian, and what he says is just, it actually does make sense if you really think about it, but on the surface, it makes no sense at all. And I think that's his problem. I think he tries too hard to be hyper specific to a point where people don't understand what he's saying. And at some point, you have to, and given his background, I get it, but at some point you have to trust the other person to just know what the heck you're talking about. And if they don't, then, well, I mean, that's just the name of the game. But anyway, JC, as far as what you said about the rapture not being an issue, what I meant was you can be a perfectly good Christian and not believe in the rapture. For example, the rapture was actually not really a mainstream doctrine in Christianity until like the 1800s, believe it or not. The verse, I read a lot of N.T. Wright, and I'll tell you what he says. The verse that people refer to where Paul uses the word rapture about us being caught up into the air on the second coming. This is where we get the idea of the rapture from. It is indicative of what would happen when a king or something or a lord returned home after going on a journey. People would go out into like on the outskirts of the city to meet him and escort him back in. And so when Paul says on the second coming that we will be caught up to meet him in the air, it's that we would meet him in the air and escort him back to earth. Because it's like if you look at Revelation, if you look at Revelation, for example, when you see the New Jerusalem isn't up in heaven and we go up to heaven. No, it's in heaven and it comes down to earth. That's why when a lot of people say heaven, this is why you got to clarify what a lot of people are talking about, because a lot of times when I refer to heaven, I could be talking about like God's space, basically where God is, or we could be talking about the New Jerusalem, depending on the context. But as far as you're thinking about the rapture not being an issue, you can believe in literally everything without believing in the rapture. Yeah. So the idea of people like the left behind thing with people just vanishing, that's not a thing biblically. But I do think it's and this is kind of why I don't like to talk about eschatology, because I do think it's kind of a non-issue. It's like you can believe in the rapture, you cannot believe in the rapture, you can be millennial, premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial. I'm amillennial because I was born in 1990. That was a little dad joke to leave you guys with. All right. Well, this is over, and I've been here for 2 hours. It's just a little impromptu thing. So I am going to dip, but I appreciate you guys being here. I didn't expect a whole 13 people to pop up. But anyway, that was good. I like that. But now I'm going to sign off. I will catch y'all on the flip side as soon as I figure out how to end the stream.